What's up everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto leaves Konoha instead of Sasuke? If you enjoy then please like, share and do comments. A young Naruto was running down the streets. Why was he running? A simple answer: he was being chased. Now for other kids this may seem strange or even terrifying. However, for young Naruto this was a weekly occurrence. Well, it used to be a weekly occurrence here. Lately it's been more of a daily occurrence. Naruto looked up onto a nearby roof. He expected to see those masked ninja that were usually following him when this happened. However, much to his distress there was no one there. He sighed and looked at the path he was currently running down. However, when he did, he saw a few more villagers cut off his path, forcing him to make a sharp turn down the nearest alleyway. Maybe I should just give up. I mean, they've been at this all day and something tells me they aren't going to give up anytime soon. He then thought as he exited the alleyway and made a few sharp turns into another alleyway. When he did, he saw he was at a dead end. He then heard the footsteps of the villagers that were behind him and quickly looked around for anything he could use. He found only a single object in this alleyway, and that object had the privilege of being a trash can. The blonde sighed and looked at it. He thought about it for only a second before he once again heard the sound of clicking soles on the ground. When he heard this, he wasted no time in jumping into it. When he did, he grabbed the lid to the trash can and put it on top of it. He cringed as he smelled some of what was around him. He then felt all of his muscles freeze as he heard a voice speak. "Damn it, looks like the slippery bastard got away from us again." He heard a male voice say. "Well, let's hurry up and find him, he couldn't have gotten far." He heard another male voice say. When he did, he raised the lid slowly and quietly as to not alert them that he was there. He then made a small hole barely large enough for him to see out of and looked at the villagers. "Well, what are we waiting for? We only have 2 more days before the Hokage gets back from the summit." He heard another villager say, looking at one of the others from before. They all then left the alleyway. However, when they did, Naruto waited a little bit before coming out of his hiding spot. When he did, he looked around and started to run for his house. Surely he'd be safe there, right? As he made his way to his house, he started to notice that the streets started to get less and less crowded. However, he soon saw why as he reached his apartment. When he saw the scene that lay before him, his eyes almost immediately widened. His apartment, the only place that he had to live, had large flames erupting from the windows. He also saw several other flames in different spots as well. "Hey, there he is!" He heard someone yell. He had been so occupied trying to process what he was seeing he hadn't realized that he was staring at his own apartment that did have several other people in front of it. People which hated and most likely wanted to hurt him. When he turned to locate the source of the voice, he saw that there were several people running towards him. He on instinct started to run. Lucky for him, there wasn't that many actually chasing him this time. As he was running, he unknowingly made his way to the park. While he was running, he ran by the lake and saw an island in the middle of it. He had never actually been there, but he had always been curious as to what it looked like. He then once again heard the all too familiar sound of running behind him. When he did, he jumped into the water. When he did, he began to swim to the center of the lake, eventually making his way to this small island. When he got there, he saw that there wasn't really much to it. A tree and some glass. That was about all there was to it, really. He then walked over to the tree and looked to the night sky. "I don't understand it," Naruto said, looking up at the sky. "I don't understand why they always go for me. What did I ever do to them? I mean, sure, I play a few pranks here and there, but I didn't think they'd burn my home down," Naruto said as he looked up to the sky. He then slowly closed his eyes and tried to sleep. However, the night wind made it a bit difficult to do that, with it chilling him to the bone every time it crossed over his body. That and the fact his clothes were still wet from where he had just crossed a lake at night made it extremely difficult for the young 6-year-old to sleep. He then felt something grab a hold of his shirt. When he felt this, his eyes almost instantly shot open, and what he saw almost made his heart drop. He saw a man with whitish gray hair and green eyes. "Finally found you," he said, picking him up by the color of his shirt. "Mizuki-sensei?" Naruto asked, looking at the male, confusion evident in his voice. "Yes, Naruto, now it's time to go," the male said, tucking him under his arm before he went off into town. Naruto was genuinely confused by this. Mizuki had always been nice to him. However, he soon remembered that everyone else was also trying to get to him. "Oh, so you hate me too?" Naruto asked, looking at the roofs that he passed along the way. The fact that the male was quite only further proved his point. However, Mizuki suddenly came to a stop and went to the edge of a roof. "Have fun, kid," the male said, holding Naruto off the ground by the back of his shirt. He then dropped the young male off the building, making him land with a solid thud against the ground. When he did hit the ground, he grunted in pain and slowly tried to get up. When he did, he found that his leg was in a massive amount of pain. He then looked down at his leg to see that it was red and was already starting to swell up. He then tried to get up, but the pain he felt from his leg made it rather difficult. He then heard the sound he had dreaded all day. The sound of clicking soles on the ground. He then tried to get up even faster. This only intensified the growing pain in his already sore leg. As he finally managed to get up, he looked down the alleyway and saw two men walking towards him. The two, even though their faces looked different, their attire was almost identical. They each wore a headband symbolizing that they were ninjas from Konoha, as well as what Naruto had come to know as a Chunin jacket. He then sighed as his sore leg finally gave out and he fell back down to the ground. At least this way it'll be over quicker, the young blonde thought as he listened to the two men approach him. When they got in front of him, Naruto just smiled his big goofy grin that he usually put on when others were around. "Hey, guys, what are you doing here?" Naruto asked, looking at them. "Oh, just hunting," one of the men said, looking at him. "Really, in the village? Okay, I'll bite. What are you hunting for?" Naruto asked, looking at them. One of the ninjas then reached down and grabbed Naruto by his collar. "Oh, just a little fox," the man said, picking him up off the ground. "Careful, man, he might figure it out because of you," the other warned, slapping him on the back of the head. "Yeah, like he's going to figure it out. If he hasn't figured it out at this day and age, I don't think he ever will," the male said, turning his attention to Naruto. He then pulled back one of his hands and delivered a firm hit to the ground 6-year-old's jaw. This caused the young blonde to spit up some more blood. When he did, he looked at the man in front of him. "Why?" was the young blind managed to ask, looking at him. "It doesn't matter, you'll be dead before you even realize why it matters," the male said, looking at him. "Hey, stop that," Naruto heard a new voice say. This actually concerned Naruto just a bit, for the sole reason that no one was ever really concerned for his well-being. He looked to the side and saw the source of the voice standing at the end of the alleyway. As it turned out, this voice belonged to a child. He had black hair as well as gray eyes. He wore white shorts and a blue shirt that had the mark of his clan on the back. "Go home, Sasuke, this doesn't concern you," one of the males said, looking at him. "Maybe not, but you are ninja, your job is to protect Konoha and its people, not hurt them," the young male said as he walked into the alleyway. "That may be true, but this is an entirely different situation," the male said, looking at the young figure. "Fire him." "How so?" Sasuke asked, looking at him. "This monster is responsible for the death of hundreds of Konoha citizens, as well as a crime that can never be forgiven," the older male said, looking at him. Sasuke then looked at the blonde that was currently on the verge of passing out. Sasuke looked at what kind of shape he was in. Sasuke then turned his attention back to the males that were in front of him. "Him a killer? It's a little hard to imagine a killer wanting to become Hokage. I also find it hard to believe that this so-called killer would be beaten by two Chunin without putting up any fight," Sasuke said, looking at him. At this point, the man that was holding Naruto was getting more than frustrated with this new unexpected guest. The male that had been quiet thus far then put his hand on his friend's shoulder and looked at him. "It's pointless to argue with an Uchiha, they always get the last word," he said, looking at him. The male that had been holding Naruto by the throat then grunted in discomfort and dropped Naruto. When he did, Naruto hit the ground and started to violently cough. Sasuke looked at the men that were in front of him and watched as they walked off into the streets. When he could no longer see them, he walked over to Naruto. When he got there, he saw that the blonde had already passed out. Sasuke looked around for anything, or rather anyone that could help him in this situation. He saw nothing and sighed. So he did what to him seemed right at the time. He turned around, slung Naruto over his shoulder and started to walk down the streets with a passed out blonde on his back. He slowly but surely made his way to his family's estate. When he finally got there, he opened up the gates and walked inside with Naruto still on his back. He then slowly walked towards the house that he stayed in. When got there, he opened the door and kicked it shut behind him. He then made his way to the living room and placed Naruto on the floor. Sasuke then walked over to the couch and sat down and looked at the male in front of him. He must have waited for no more than 10 minutes before the blonde started to stir in front of him. When the young blonde was fully awake, he looked around and spotted the other male in front of him. Sasuke? What am I doing here? Naruto asked, looking at him. After those men left, I took you to my home. Now if you don't mind, I got a few questions of my own. The raven-haired male said, looking at him. Naruto then sighed and looked at him. Go ahead, it's not like I got anywhere else to be at this point, he said, looking at him. Okay, first off, why were those ninjas attacking you? Sasuke asked, looking at him. I wish I knew. Everyone's been acting like that today. I heard one of them say it was because the Hokage was at something called a cage summit, but I don't know what that is, so I guess it doesn't really help. Naruto said, looking at him. Sasuke nodded, almost as if he understood what Naruto was saying. Alright, next question. Why did they say you're a murderer? Have you actually killed people before? Sasuke asked, looking at him. Naruto shook his head side to side and looked at him. No, but they aren't the only ones that accuse me of that. A lot of others seem to think I'm a murderer too. Naruto said, looking at him. Why? Sasuke asked, looking at him. I don't know, it's always been like this, Naruto said, looking away from the raven-haired male. Why haven't you told anyone about this? Sasuke asked, looking at him. Naruto then sighed and placed his head on one of his hands. Who am I supposed to tell? Almost the entire population of the village hates me and the others just don't want anything to do with me. I've tried telling the Hokage a few times, but nothing ever changes when I do. Naruto said, looking at him. I see, Sasuke said, looking at him. He then turned his head to the side and looked at a local clock that was hanging on the wall. Well, you might want to start heading home, it's getting a little late. The male said, looking at him. I can't do that either, Naruto said, a little sad. Why not? Sasuke asked, looking at him. They burned my apartment down today, Naruto said, looking at him. Sasuke's eyes widened as he heard this and looked at him. And you're certain it was them? He asked, looking at the young blonde in front of him. Yeah, I'm certain. When I went home because I thought I'd be safe there, I found it on fire and a bunch of people standing in front of it, Naruto said, looking at him. Sasuke gritted his teeth and looked at Naruto. I mean, sure, Sasuke might not have liked Naruto, if anything he hated him, but this was just getting ridicules. The people of the village are singling him out and even the ninjas are taking part of it now. There's no way he's going to survive if this keeps up. Sasuke then looked at Naruto and said the first thing that came to his mind. Then why don't you leave? He asked, looking at the young male. What? Naruto asked, a little confused. Why don't you leave? I mean, if people are really treating you like this every day and things aren't getting any better for you, then why don't you just leave? Sasuke said, looking at him. But then I'd be considered a rough nin. Naruto started, only to be cut off by the young male that was looking at him. No, you wouldn't. A rough ninja is a ninja that leaves their village. You're not one of our ninjas yet. Which means you can leave and be free of consequence. Sasuke said, looking at him. The blonde then looked down as if he was considering the idea. It looked as if he was considering the idea but just need a little extra push to make it happen. Look at it this way. You'll leave a village where people hate you and you're treated like dirt, and in turn you may find a place where the people like you and you're welcomed home with people smiling at your return. Sasuke said, looking at him. Naruto was quiet for a moment before a smile overtook his face and he looked at the male in front of him. You know what, Sasuke, you're right, I'm leaving the village. Who needs this crappy place? Naruto said, looking at him. Sasuke mentally smirked at this. Not only did he possibly give someone a better life, but he also managed to get rid of someone he hated without getting into any real trouble. Naruto then stopped when he reached the door and looked down. Sasuke saw this and looked at him. What's wrong? I thought you were going to leave the village? Sasuke asked, looking at him. Well, I was, but I don't have anywhere to go. I mean, I never had any family that I know of, so where am I supposed to go? Naruto asked, looking at him. Sasuke then looked down at the ground and thought for a moment. However, while he was thinking, Naruto also brought up another point. And that's only if I manage to get outside of the gates. I mean, those people hate me, why on earth would they let me leave? Naruto said, looking at him. Sasuke thought about it for a moment then sighed. We'll think more about it later, Sasuke said, looking at him. He then walked into the kitchen, and when he saw that Naruto wasn't following behind him, he turned to look at the blonde male. Well, aren't you coming, dope? He asked, looking at him. Naruto got a little irritated at the fact Sasuke had decided to call him by his nickname but answered nonetheless. Well, it's just that this is your house and I don't want to. Well, take advantage of your kindness. Naruto said, looking at him. What kindness? Sasuke asked, looking at the blonde male. Well, it's just you've done more for me today than anyone else has in years. You saved me from someone, took me to your house, are planning to help me with something, and now you're heading to the kitchen. I mean, I just feel like you've done too much for me already. Naruto said, looking at him. Sasuke then thought about what he said and looked at him. Yeah, well, I wouldn't get used to it, you're leaving, remember? Sasuke said, looking at him. Naruto nodded and looked at him. Once they got into the kitchen, Sasuke walked over to some cabinets and looked for some food. He didn't find anything that he had the time or energy to cook, well, nothing except for a few cups of instant ramen. When he saw them, he pulled out the instant ramen in a cup and looked at Naruto. I usually don't eat these, but they're all I ever see you eat, so why not? Sasuke said, tossing him a cup. The raven-haired male then walked over to the sink and began to run some water. He turned to look at Naruto while he was waiting for it to get warm and saw Naruto looking at the cup a bit nervous. What's wrong? Sasuke asked, looking at him. Naruto then looked at him and smiled a sad smile. This may seem a little hard to believe, but I actually don't like ramen, he said, looking at him. Sasuke's face then went from its emotionless feature to his confused look. Naruto saw this and decided to explain. Well, you see, the reason I'm always eating ramen is because it's really the only thing I can afford to buy, Naruto said, looking at him. What do you mean? Sasuke said, looking at him. Well, I don't have parents or a clan estate like you, so I'm forced to get money however I can. However, what I do save up usually isn't enough to get anything that will last. That and the stuff that will last the store clerks and managers usually won't sell to me for a fair price, so I'm usually forced to settle for ramen. Naruto said, looking at him. He then looked up at Sasuke, a little nervous. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm glad you're sharing your food with me, but I just thought I'd tell you something interesting about me before I left, Naruto said as he walked over to the sink and filled the cup with water. Sasuke then started to fill his cup up with hot water, and when he did, he walked into the living room only to see Naruto giving thanks for the food. It's amazing, Sasuke thought as he looked at Naruto. He's still able to smile like that. People treat him like this and yet he's still able to smile. The young raven-haired male thought as he also sat down and started to eat. They finished around the same time, and when they did, Sasuke moved his cup to the side and looked at Naruto. Alright, now that we're done eating, I think it's about time we started discussing how you're going to leave. The raven-haired male said, looking at him. Alright, so any plans? Naruto asked, looking at the male in front of him. Sasuke lowered his head in a thinking pose. The room became quiet as Sasuke began to think about how he could get Naruto out of the village without drawing attention to him. He thought about it and only a few ideas came to mind. Hey Naruto, how good are you at the clone jutsu? Sasuke asked, looking at him. It's pretty crappy, Naruto admitted, looking at him. Okay, well, there goes my first idea, Sasuke thought, looking at him. Alright, well, do you have any way to get a hold of some explosive? Sasuke asked, looking at him. I could try stealing them, but since all the shop owners hate me, I find it hard to believe that I wouldn't get the blame for it almost immediately, Naruto said, looking at him. And there goes idea number 2. That only leaves the last idea, Sasuke thought as he looked at Naruto. Alright, well, I do have a plan. As to how we are going to pull it off, I'll explain that part tomorrow, Sasuke said, looking at him. He then stood up and looked at the blonde. Follow me, I'll show you where you can sleep tonight, Sasuke said, looking at him. They then started to walk down a long hallway, and at the end of the hallway there was a room. Sasuke then opened up the door and let Naruto inside. When the blonde entered the room, he saw that there was a bed, a desk, and a closet. Other than that, there wasn't much to it. Is this a spare bedroom or something? Naruto asked, looking at the raven-haired male. Well, it used to be my brother's bedroom, Sasuke said, looking at him. However, since he's not here anymore, I guess he won't mind if someone else sleeps in it, Sasuke said as he shut the door behind him. Naruto then looked at the bed and slowly walked over to it. When he laid down on it, he noticed that it was several times softer than the one he had been given to sleep on. He then sighed. He had never been given a place to sleep that was so comforting. I really will have to thank him before I leave tomorrow, were the blonde's last words as he slowly drifted off to sleep. However, the blonde awoke to the unusual situation of feeling someone kick him in the side. Come on, I've already pushed him off the bed, what else can I do to him? Sasuke said as he continued to lightly kick the male's side. Alright, I'm up, Naruto said as he looked at the male. Naruto let out a tired yawn, and when he did he felt a bag hit him in the face. When the blonde looked at it, he saw that there were several supplies inside of it. When the blonde looked at the only other male in front of him, he sighed and looked at him. I was up last night gathering supplies for you, Sasuke said looking at him. Why? Was all the blonde could manage to say at the moment. Well, you said that your house was burned down, so I figured that you probably wouldn't last long without any supplies. So I got up last night and got what I thought was important. Sasuke said looking at the young blonde male in front of him. Alright, but why? Naruto said looking at him. Well, I could only think of one other plan, and with it, you're going to need a decent-sized head start, Sasuke said looking at him. Sasuke then looked at him and turned around to head out of the room. Let's go, it'd be better if we did this now rather than later, Sasuke said as he left the room. Naruto nodded and followed behind him. They walked outside, and from there they walked down the alleyways. So what is this plan? Naruto asked as they were walking down the streets. You don't need to know just yet, Sasuke said as they made a sharp turn around a corner and ran down the streets. It was still early in the morning, so not many people were out yet, and those that weren't paying that much attention to what was going on around them. When the two young males got to where they could see the front gate, they stopped. Sasuke then turned around and looked at Naruto. He then pulled out a kunai and handed it to the blonde. Make sure you don't lose this, Sasuke said looking at him. You're going to need it in case you get attacked or if you run out of supplies and need to do some hunting. The raven-haired male said looking at him. Alright, but what do we do now? Naruto asked looking at him. Sasuke then looked down at the ground. This is going to be the hard part for both you and me. However, this will not only get them away from the gate, but it will also give you some form of insurance. Sasuke said looking at him. What do you mean? Naruto asked looking at him. I mean that after you do this you won't be able to return to Konoha again after you do this, Sasuke said looking at him. Alright, well, what is it? Naruto asked looking at the male in front of him. You're going to have to stab me with that kunai I gave you, Sasuke said looking at him. What? Naruto asked, not believing what he had just heard. However, the volume of what he had said came out much louder than he had wanted it to, which in turn got Sasuke to deliver a firm blow to the back of his head. Be quiet, you idiot, do you want to attract attention? Just picture the situation you're in right now, Sasuke said looking at him. Naruto then nodded and looked at him. But why do you want me to stab you? I mean, you could die if I do. Naruto asked looking at the male. Yes, and that's part of my plan. You see, when you stab me, I'm going to wait until you get over by the gate, and when you do I'll walk over there and do some acting. When they see how bad I'm bleeding they'll take me to the hospital, giving you the chance you need to get out of the village. When you're finally out of the village I'll tell them that you are the one that stabbed me, and when I do others will start to look for you, not realizing that you have already left the village. Sasuke said looking at him. But where am I supposed to go? Naruto asked looking at the male in front of him. Go to one of the other villages. You wanted to be a ninja, right? Well, what better way than going to one of the others? Sasuke said looking at him. Naruto looked like he was starting to doubt the plan, so Sasuke decided to remind him what it was he was doing this for. Remember, Naruto, you need to get out of the village if you ever want to get a better life. Trust me, I know what I'm doing, Sasuke said looking at him. Naruto thought about what he said for a moment before he nodded and looked at him. Alright, I'll do it, Naruto said looking at him. Alright, good, just give me a moment to prepare myself, otherwise I might go into shock, Sasuke said looking at him. Naruto then nodded and looked at him. Sasuke then nodded and looked at him, then put out his arms. Alright, I'm ready whenever you are, the young male said. Naruto then nodded and dashed forward. When he did, Sasuke closed his eyes and felt a sharp pain in his stomach. Sasuke then opened his eyes to see that the kunai was in his stomach. Naruto then pulled it out, causing blood to drip on the floor. Alright, get going and make it quick before I pass out from blood loss, Sasuke said looking at him. Naruto then nodded and ran across the street and made his way beside the front gate. When he did, he hid in a bush that happened to be by the entrance. Sasuke saw this and began to walk towards the gate. Help, Sasuke said in a weak tone. Both of the males heard this and looked to see what was going on. When they did, the only thing they saw was the blood coming from Sasuke. They both almost instantly got out and ran towards him. Sasuke then fell down in front of them. One of them put their hand on Sasuke's head and began to panic. "Oh no, he's cold, we need to get him to the hospital," one of the males said as he picked the young Uchiha up. The two then dashed off. Naruto saw this and looked at the village gates. He then took a deep breath and began to run through the woods. When he did, only one thought crossed his mind. "Thank you, Sasuke." Naruto was currently running through the woods. He hadn't once stopped running since he left Konoha. He was out of breath, and even with his legendary stamina, running for long periods of time can really do a number on you. He stopped in front of a tree and looked up at the sky. When he did, he finally noticed how dark it was. The moon was already in the center of the sky, and several of the stars had already made their presence known. As he looked up at the sky, he sighed and his stomach let out a loud growl. Which in all honesty wasn't that surprising. He had been running ever since he left Konoha, stopping for almost no reason. When he did stop, it was only to use the bathroom. Naruto then took the bag from his back and looked through it to see what Sasuke had given him for when left the village. Surprisingly, he had little to no food inside it. However, Naruto wasn't a very picky eater, and when he found an apple waiting for him inside, he didn't hesitate to take it. When he took his first bite, he felt some of the juices run down his mouth slightly. However, as he was eating, he heard something that sounded very strange. It wasn't a human, that much he could be sure of. It sounded like an animal was hurt. He, against his better judgment, got up and walked towards the sound. When he got there, he saw that there was a fox in a bear trap. Naruto was a little wary of it at first, seeing as how it was growling at him and showing its teeth. However, for a reason unknown to him, it quickly calmed down. Seeing this, Naruto decided to slowly make his way closer to the small creature. When he was about a foot away, he reached for it, and like before, it showed its teeth and started to growl at him. When it did this, he pulled his hand away and it stopped. As the blonde looked at the small animal before him, he found himself looking at its paw and feeling sorry for it. He knew what that felt like. Well, not being in a bear trap but having no one else there for you. Naruto then reached for the bear trap, and the fox once again started to growl at him. This only stopped Naruto for a second or two as he continued to reach for it, the small metal device. When he did, he saw the fox lunge forward and try to bite him. He jerked his hand back quickly when he saw this and looked at the fox. "Alright, look, buddy, I'm just trying to help you. If you want to get out of this, then you're going to have to trust me. After I get you out of this thing, you can do whatever you want and roam free like before," Naruto said, looking at the small creature. This, however, didn't stop the fox from growling at him. When Naruto reached for the small device for the second time, he saw that the fox was watching him carefully. When he got close to the metal trap, like before, the fox lunged at him, the only difference between this time and last time being that fox actually did bite him. Naruto squeezed his eyes shut in pain, however he then relaxed very quickly. "Huh, you know, your bite didn't hurt as much as I thought it would," Naruto said, looking at the small animal that was currently biting one of his hands. He didn't know why the bite didn't hurt, but to him it really didn't matter. As he once again reached for the small metal device, the fox eventually got tired and released the blonde from his jaws. Naruto then placed a hand on each part of the device and started to pry two pieces of metal apart. He struggled with it just a bit, but when it was wide enough for the fox to escape, the animal wasted no time in removing its paw from the trap. When it did, Naruto let go of the trap, forcing the jaw piece to snap together once again. When Naruto looked at the fox, it stared at him for a moment before it ran away into the woods. Naruto then sighed as he once again looked at the apple he had been eating. It had gotten dirt all over it, and the parts that he had eaten had already started to have grown brown spots on it. When he saw this, he sighed and turned the apple around and started to eat it once again. As long as he avoided the dirty spots, it shouldn't do any harm, right? Naruto then felt a yawn come to the surface. When it did, he sighed and placed his book bag on top of himself to keep himself warm. As he slept, he felt his body shake slightly, but it eventually stopped when he fell deep into slumber. In Konoha, Hiruzen had just arrived at the village. However, he was a little surprised to see what he did. He saw several lanterns up, as well as several people drinking sake, as well eating foods that were usually expensive. As he walked by in all the confusion, he looked at the man to his right. "I want you to tell me what's going on when I get to the Hokage's office," he said in a very confused manner. The Anbu nodded through his mask and jumped into the air. Hiruzen only saw him clear a few buildings before he vanished out of sight. His worries only grew as he saw a large sign in front of the gates that lead to the Hokage mansion that read, "We finally did it." As he slowly walked up the stairs he saw the man who was running the bottom counter look away. In fact, to Hiruzen his facial expression looked to hold a mix of both nervousness and fear. As he walked up the steps he had a theory about what had happened, and to put it simply, he didn't like. As he opened the door to the Hokage office he saw the man that he had sent to gather info no more than 5 minutes ago standing there, not by himself, though he also had 2 other people who were also wearing Anbu masks standing behind him looking what he would describe as nervous. He didn't need to see their faces to know that's what they were. He has been a ninja for more than 4 decades. He had more than learned to pick up if someone was nervous just from their body language. As he sat down he looked at the 3 in front of him. He then got his pipe and started to smoke. The member that was in front of the other 2 then stepped forward. "Lord Third Hokage, I have learned what is going on, and to put it simply, while you were gone a lot happened," he said looking at him. Hiruzen then blew out a cloud of smoke and looked at the man that was standing no less than 3 feet in front of him. "Alright, well, please start from the beginning if you don't mind," Hiruzen said, sticking his pipe back in his mouth. "Alright, so you remember these 2, right? The 2 that were assigned to protect Naruto while you were gone?" the man asked looking at him. Hiruzen then looked at him and nodded. "Right, well, apparently these 2 did nothing to protect or even watch over Naruto for that matter. This, of course, led to several other events taking place." "What events took place?" Hiruzen asked, his teeth begging to dig into the metal tip of his pipe. "Well, Naruto was changed around by civilians and people alike. While we were also gone, stores refused to serve Naruto and his house was burned down. They are currently starting construction there as we speak. They apparently no longer have a problem repairing that building now that, and I quote, the demon freak isn't living there. We have also located another source of information from one Sasuke Uchiha," he said looking at him. "Is he willing to speak?" Hiruzen asked looking at him a little worried. It was a well-known fact that Sasuke and Naruto never really got along. So he could only imagine that if what he had to say was true then he wouldn't share that information willingly. "Yes, he has said he will answer any questions you have for him. However, he will also be asking his own question, and just like he is doing with you, he expects an honest answer," the male in front of him said. Hiruzen then leaned back and thought about it for a moment. When he was done he looked at the male in front of him. "Tell Sasuke I agree to his terms. I would also like to speak to him as soon as possible," Hiruzen said looking at him. The man then left, leaving him and the 2 other Anbu alone. "Now you 2 refused to protect Naruto," the elderly man said looking at them. "I made it very clear that this was going to be an S-class mission when I assigned it to you," he said standing up. "Tell me, you 2, do you know what the penalty for breaking an S-class mission is?" Hiruzen asked looking at them. They both lowered their heads, although because Hiruzen wasn't looking he continued. "I assume that your silence means that you do know. The penalty is death," Hiruzen said looking at them. "I want each of you to report to Anko and tell her of your betrayal," Hiruzen said looking at them. They both nodded and began to walk down the stairs. Hiruzen then got out his Hokage ball and an image of Naruto appeared. When he saw that he was fine with a bag on his stomach he sighed a breath of relief. However, he then saw a fox approach him. Hiruzen got a little concerned at this because it's a well-known fact that foxes are scavengers. Hiruzen then watched as the fox smelled Naruto's hand. It wasn't until now that he realized that Naruto's right hand was covered in blood. The fox then pulled away from his hand and got on top of the backpack Naruto was holding to his chest. When it was on top of it the small creature let out a tired yawn and curled up into a little ball, then started to sleep. The elderly man then heard a knock on the door and put his ball away. "Come in," he said as he looked at the door. He then saw the man from before walk inside with Sasuke, who for an unknown reason had bandages around his abdomen. "You wanted to speak with me, Lord Third Hokage," Sasuke said, bowing at the elderly man in front of him. "Yes indeed, so Sasuke, please take a seat," he said, gesturing to one of the seats that were on the side of the room. Sasuke nodded and walked over to one of the seats and looked at him. "So how do you want to do this?" the elderly man asked looking at the young male. "How about you ask all the questions you want, then when you're done I'll ask what I want," Sasuke proposed looking at the elderly man. "Sounds fair enough," the elderly man stated as he looked at the raven-haired boy in front of him. "Alright, first question, what happened to Naruto?" Hiruzen asked looking at him. He left the village, Sasuke stated very calmly. Why would he do that? Hiruzen asked, looking at the young male, confusion written on his face. He was tired of the way people treated him around here, Sasuke said, looking at the ground. In all honesty, I don't blame him. If they had treated me the way they treated him, I would have left a long time ago. Sasuke thought to himself in slight rage. I see, how do you know this? Hiruzen asked, looking at him. I helped him get out of the village, Sasuke said, looking at him. I see, Hiruzen stated as he then fell quiet for a moment. He's too young to know about the law I passed 6 years ago. I could punish him for having a civilian leave with possible secrets. Then again, what good would having a battle with the civilian council do me? They'd probably just find some way to blame it on Naruto. Hiruzen thought as he looked at the boy. How'd you get that wound? Hiruzen asked, looking at Sasuke. Could I maybe answer this one in private? Sasuke asked, looking at him. Why, of course, Hiruzen said, snapping his fingers, which signaled the Anbu to leave the room. After the young raven-haired male looked around the room to make sure that it was only them inside the office, he sighed and looked at the elder man in front of him. I got this wound from Naruto. It was part of the plan we used to help get him out of the village. In hindsight, it worked, but probably wasn't the best plan, Sasuke said, looking at the Hokage. Hiruzen then looked up at the ceiling and sighed. The more he thought about it, the more his head hurt. Alright, final questions, the white-haired male said, looking at the younger male in front of him. Why did you help Naruto leave the village, and what do you think about him leaving? Hiruzen asked, looking at him. In all honesty, I think it's probably for the best. I mean, I never knew how badly they treated him until I caught a glimpse of it firsthand. It wasn't a pretty sight. As for why I helped him leave, it's a very simple answer. No one should be forced to stay in a village where they're hated and people treat them like trash. In all honesty, I'm surprised he didn't leave sooner, Sasuke said, looking at him. Sasuke, would you be willing to identify the man you saw with Naruto that night? Hiruzen asked, looking at him. Yes, I would, although it was 2 men, not 1, Sasuke said, looking at him. I see, Hiruzen then once again snapped his fingers and an Anbu appeared before him. What is it, Lord Hokage? He asked with a bow. I want all ninja that were out of their homes past. Sasuke, what time would you say you saw Naruto? The elderly man asked, looking at the young male in front of him. Sasuke then shrugged and looked at him. Around 9 if I had to take a guess. Hiruzen then nodded and looked at the Anbu, and the masked figure nodded. Within seconds of receiving his new orders, he bowed and disappeared out of the room. The elderly man then looked at the young male who was still in front of him. Well, ask away, Hiruzen said, looking at him. Sasuke then nodded and looked at him. I'm going to ask one question, Sasuke said, looking at him. The elderly man nodded and looked at him, waiting for his oncoming question. There were so many possibilities and Hiruzen was prepared for any of them. Sasuke then took a deep breath and looked at the elderly man. What are you not telling me about Naruto? He asked, looking at him. Hiruzen then smiled at his luck and said, there are a lot of things about Naruto that you and this village for that matter don't know. Hiruzen said, looking at the young male. The raven-haired male was clearly not satisfied with his answer, but he didn't want to be the last Uchiha that doesn't know how to keep his word. So he sighed and left the building. Hiruzen grabbed his pipe and was about to place it into his mouth, however he ended up snapping it before it could reach its destination. The nerve of this village and its ninja. I mean, most if not all civilians know about my law and the punishment behind it. The fact the ninja are now breaking an Anbu rank ninja no less. This just goes to show how far this village has really fallen. Hiruzen thought as he unknowingly to him released a massive amount of ki. It was a good thing that no one else was in the room with him, otherwise they might just have personally learned why he had earned the title of Shinobi no Kami. He looked up at the statue of the 4th Hokage and sighed. Minato, I have failed you. Please forgive me, he unconsciously said aloud. As he did, he then sat back down in his chair and sighed. When he did, he picked the Hokage ball back up and placed it in front of him. He then watched Naruto's sleeping from as the young child began to stir in his sleep. I hope that Sasuke is right and that this does turn out to be an improvement on your life. Naruto, I won't be able to watch over you anymore. If I do, then the civilian council will not only accuse me of helping you but will also most likely track you down. Hiruzen thought as he looked at the small figure sleeping. Goodbye Naruto, he said as the image of him faded from his ball. With Naruto Naruto awoke to the most unusual sensation of something wet and kind of rough being rubbed across his face. When he looked up at the sky he saw that it was still nighttime. When he got up he let out a yawn and looked for whatever had just woke him up. When he did he saw the same fox from earlier looking at him. "Don't tell me you are what woke me up," Naruto stated as he looked at the small creature in front of him. When he did it let out a small yip and started to wag its tail back and forth. He then sighed in irritation. He may not know much about wildlife but he did know it was centered around two animals, foxes and rabbits. So he was a bit more than a little displeased that a fox had been the thing to wake him up because he knew that most breeds of fox were nocturnal. He then sighed as he looked at it. When he did it got up and looked at him. Naruto tried to go back to sleep much to the small animal's disapproval. However, no matter how hard he tried he just could fall back to sleep. He then sat up and looked at the fox that was at the moment still staring him down. "I hope you're happy now because of you I'm awake and can't go back to sleep." When he said this the fox once again lets out a small yip. Naruto sighed at this and slowly made his way up off the ground. When he was on his feet he dusted himself off and began to walk through the woods. He didn't really see the point in running now. He had been running ever since he left Konoha and that was more than 12 hours ago, so he has to have some form of distance in between him and the village, right? As he walked through the woods he heard something following him. When he looked behind him he saw a small red figure following him. Naruto then sped up a little bit and to his disappointment the fox did as well. He continued to slowly increase his speed until his was in a full-blown sprint. As he was running, he did a little trick that he learned running from some of the villagers that he had pranked. He jumped up in mid-air and turned around to see if it was still behind him. When he saw this he grew a little irritated and landed on his feet, bringing himself to a stop. Naruto then turned around and saw that the fox was sitting down in front of him. The blonde then hung his head in defeat and let out a sigh. "Alright, fine, you can come with me," Naruto said, causing the small fox to let out a slight yip. Naruto then looked at it and turned around and once again started to walk. As he did his stomach once again growled and he clutched it slightly. When he did he then heard an increase of footsteps and turned around to see the fox running away. "Really, I run away from it but I get hungry and it acts like I'm going to eat it or something." Naruto sighed as he continued to walk. He then heard what he recognized as running water. When he heard this he ran towards it and saw that there was indeed a small river flowing through the middle of the woods. He then looked down to see if he could spot anything that he could possibly catch, however in this darkness it did him little to no good. He could barely see 3 feet in front of him, let alone through the water. As he continued to look he thought he heard something. When he looked to his side he once again saw the fox and it was looking at something in the water. Naruto then thought the small animal was helping him and smiled. However, still couldn't see where the animals were. Naruto then remembers the kunai that Sasuke had given him. Naruto then walked behind the fox and looked at where he was pointing. He took a guess at where whatever he was pointing at was and threw the kunai at it. When he did he went into the water and pulled out the kunai to reveal that nothing was on it. He sighed at this and once again heard the small fox yipping at something. This time, the blonde wasted no time in running over to where it was and throwing the knife in the water. When he went into the water this time to pull out the knife he found that a small, almost 6 inches long fish was on the end of it. Naruto then once again heard the fox barking and ran over to where it was. He tried several times to catch several different fish, however most of the time he didn't catch a fish. After his arm had gotten tired he looked at what he had caught and counted 4 fish. "Well, that's 2 for me and 2 for you at least," Naruto said, looking at the small animal in front of him. He then looked inside the bag for anything at all that could help him cook the fish he had just caught. When he looked through it, he found a small lighter. Naruto smiled at his luck and placed the lighter in his pocket and then went off to find some things to build a fire with. He walked through the woods and just picked up different sticks that he found lying on the ground. When he had found what he considered to be enough to start a fire he walked out of the woods and once more by the river he had been at. It was around this time that he felt the few rays of the sunshine on his body warming up his body slightly. He then placed the sticks in a pile, taking out one for himself. He then looked at the lighter and lit it. When he did he placed it in the center of the pile and waited for it to slowly build. When he saw that the fire was big enough to last on its own he took his hand away, taking the lighter with him, and waited for the flames to become big enough to cook the fish over. When they were finally big enough, he put 2 fish on a stick and started to slowly cook them. As he waited, he looked to the sky and saw something that looked like the Hokage's hat. I wonder if Gigi's made at me leaving the village? The blonde thought out loud as he looked up at the sky. When he looked back to the food he was preparing for him and his new companion, he saw that it was about ready and took one off the stick and handed it to the small creature in front of him. He then watched as the small animal looked at it for a second as if it was pouncing on something. This caused Naruto to giggle slightly. You know, as much as I hate to admit it, the little guy is kind of cute. Naruto thought to himself as he watched the small animal consume the fish. Naruto then shook these thoughts out of his head as he also began to eat his own fish. Once he was done with his fish, he put the 2 remaining fish on the stick and also started to cook them as well. As he did, he looked at the small fox that was at the moment trying to catch a butterfly. This once again caused him to let out a small giggle. It's kind of funny to think that you were the one that bite me less than a day ago. Now look at us here, we are eating fish together. Naruto thought as he looked at the small creature. He then averted his gaze to the fish once more and saw that these fish were also almost done. Naruto then took them off the fire and looked at the fox. It wasn't paying much attention to him, so he tried something. He whistled for it. When he did, the fox looked at him and walked over to him. How strange, Naruto thought looking at it. He then smiled and took another fish off the stick and placed it in front of it. The fox this time wasted no time in grabbing the fish and starting to eat it. It came to me when I called for it. Most wild animals don't do that. Is it possible you had a master before? Naruto thought to himself looking at the small creature. However, an odd thought then crossed his mind. However, unlike all his previous thoughts, he said this one aloud. You know, we need to find a name for you, he said, looking down at the small fox in front of him. This caused the red creature to look up at him and tilt its head sideways. Don't look at me like that. I mean, if we're going to be traveling together, then of course I'm going to have to call you something other than fox, Naruto said, looking at the small animal in front of him. The small animal then lets out a small bark and looked at him in anticipation. Naruto then looked up thoughtfully for a second before he looked back down with a smile on his face. I got it, how about we call you? I got it, how about we call you Kitsune? Naruto said, looking at the small creature in front of him. When he said this, the fox turned its head to the side almost as if it was a little disappointed with his choice. Yeah, it's got everything we need in a name. It's nice, simple, easy to remember and not that hard to say, Naruto said, looking at the small animal in front of him. The fox then lets out what his version of a sigh must have been. It then looked up at him and let out a slight yip. The fox that was now known as Kitsune watched as Naruto got up off the ground, dusted himself off and looked at him. Alright, Kitsune, now let's go, Naruto said, looking at him. The fox nodded and followed behind him. As they were walking, Naruto then realized that he still had not decided where it was he wanted to go. He then looked down at the small fox in front of him and came to a stop. It looked at it for a second before he mumbled the words, "It's worth a shot." When he said this, he got down to eye level with the animal and looked at it. I know this is kind of a long shot, but do you know where any of the other ninja villages are? He asked, looking at it. When he did, Kitsune let out a slight yip, then began to walk off into the forest, completely changing directions from where he and Naruto were going. Naruto smiled and walked behind it. However, as he did, he heard a slight crashing sound in the distance. He decided it wasn't important and just shrugged it off. However, as he followed the fox, he got a strange feeling. It was the type PF feeling that you get when you feel like someone's watching, but then you turn around and no one was there. Naruto felt a slight chill run up his spine as he continued to follow the fox. The blonde also noticed that a fog was starting to form. However, it suddenly became very thick, so thick in fact that Naruto could no longer see a foot in front of him. When he did, he felt something cold and hard pressed up against his throat. When he felt this, he suddenly stopped and heard a voice follow behind it. You know, that's a pretty good genjutsu you have on yourself. I for a second almost thought that you were a real child walking through the woods. He heard a male voice say. What? I am a kid, Naruto said, a little confused. The blonde then tried to turn around, but when he did, he felt the same blade move closer to his throat and press into it slightly. This stopped the young blonde in his tracks and he continued to look into the thick fog. I'm telling you, mister, I have no idea what you're talking about, Naruto said as his body began to shake with fear. Oh, really? Then how do you explain the fox? It was leading you directly to our village. You expect us to believe that you were following a fox that was heading towards our village with you having no reason to follow it? The man asked, drawing the blade closer to his neck, causing some blood to trickle down Naruto's neck. There's a village around here? Really? Ah, man, that's great. Hey, can I join your village? Naruto asked with a smile on his face. This actually stopped the man dead in his tracks. Join the village where the first person you met threatened you? Is this kid even sane? The man thought to himself before he looked down at the boy and saw that he had performed the release technique a while ago and nothing seemed to be different. He then took his kunai away from the blonde's neck and sighed. I better not get a lecture from Shibuki about this. The older male mumbled as he looked at the male in front of him. Alright, well, if you really want to join then follow me. The male said, looking at Naruto. This caused Naruto to smile and follow behind him. Naruto then nodded and noticed that Kitsune wasn't with him. Actually, could you give me a minute? Naruto asked, looking at him. What? Why did you lose something? The man asked, looking at him. Well, sorta, you were right about the fox, it's smart, for some odd reason. However, the few days I guess you could say we've sort of bounded, so I just wanted to find Kitsune before we went to the village was all. Naruto said, looking at the male in front of him. When the male heard this, he was slightly surprised but sighed. He then reached into his jacket and pulled out a bottle of sake. Sure thing, kid, we'll spend, let's say, 5 minutes looking for your pet, then we head to the village. He said, looking at him as he took a rather large gulp of his sake. At Konoha, Hiruzen was currently looking at a few documents he had to fill out. It was stressful on the old man. He had gone through almost everything in the world, yet the only enemy he cannot overcome is all this paperwork he had to do. However, he internally smiled as a man came into his office. This meant that he no longer had to do paperwork, so he was very excited. Lord Third, we have some news, the Enbu said, looking at the older male in front of him. Oh well, is it good news or bad news? The elderly man asked, looking at the figure in front of him. For you, bad. For the rest of the village, they'll probably see it as good news. The man said, looking at him. Really? Well, what is it? Hiruzen asked, looking at him. Well, we have recovered a body. It was burned pretty badly, but we believe this young individual is Naruto. The man said, looking at him. Hiruzen gasped and nearly choked on his pipe when he heard this and looked at the man in front of him with a surprised look on his face. What? How can you be so sure? Hiruzen asked, looking at the man in front of him. Well, we aren't 100% sure, but we are almost certain that this burned body belongs to Naruto. The body was burned beyond all recognition, so there's no way to be certain that this is Naruto. However, using chakra and a few other means I'm not comfortable with discussing, we were able to find out the following about this individual. The man said, placing some papers on his desk. Hiruzen sighed and picked up the document. He scanned it over and got to the information part of it. Let's see, according to this, they were able to find out that the burned body was 6 years old and malnourished. Certainly sounds like Naruto off the bat, however, we can't proclaim anything just yet. Let's see, even the teeth were burned, so there's no way to tell if it's him or not. Oh, on the victim's stomach they found a seal. They tried to remove the seal, however nothing appeared when they did. Hiruzen felt his heart drop at the last part. He knew that Naruto had a seal on his stomach. Heck, everyone knew that much. However, they tried to take it out and nothing appeared. That fit Naruto almost perfectly. If he was burned, then, of course, the Kyuubi would also be dead, explaining why they couldn't get it out of the seal. Hiruzen sighed and looked at the Anbu in front of him. Thank you for this information. You are dismissed, he said, looking at him. He nodded and disappeared into thin air. When he was alone, Hiruzen felt tears come to his eyes and walked over to the window to stare up at the Hokage monuments. Oh, Minato, your son, the last of your clan and hero of this village, has been killed. How disappointed you would be in all of us. I have failed you and this village has failed you, Hiruzen said as he stared up at the rocks. However, if he had looked a little closer, if his eyes weren't blinded by tears, he would have been able to see two figures standing on top of the second Hokage's head. One of these figures was an old man with bandages covering his right arm and his right eye. The other was the Anbu that was just in his office just moments ago. Lord Danzo, the documents have been delivered, the man said, looking at the elderly male in front of him. Good, now that Hiruzen thinks that Naruto is dead, we are free to keep searching with little to no interference, Danzo said, looking at him. So we keep searching for Naruto then? The Anbu asked, looking at him. Of course you keep searching, you idiot. The elderly man said looking at him. When he said this the Anbu nodded, turned around and disappeared. However, Danzo looked over at the village and when he did he smiled. Konoha cure soon, very soon. I promise that you will be under my control. Once I have Naruto in my possession and turn him into a root agent, there won't be anything that can stop me from becoming Hokage and making this village my own. Danzo said aloud as he looked at the village. So for now people of Konoha cure sleep well. Cause sooner or later you all will be under my control. He said as he turned around and began to walk away. Somewhere outside of Konoha, an elderly man with long white hair was currently flirting with two waitresses. He also had a bottle of sake in both hands as well as two red stains on his face, indicating that he had drunk more than his fair share of sake already. Yeah, Satsuki, it's all legit. I'm a very successful actor in the land of snow. In fact, I've starred in several movies. He said looking at the girl in front of him. Oh wow, that's so cool. I wish we got customers like you more often, the young woman said looking at him. However, their conversation was interrupted when a man appeared in front of him. When he did, Jiraiya gained a serious expression and leaned forward. He then turned to the girl that was at his side and sighed. Please leave me and my friend alone for a few moments, he said looking at the female. Oh okay, but don't keep me waiting long, a girl can lose interest very quickly. The young female said walking away. Alright, so what do you got for me? Jiraiya asked looking at the male in front of him. Well, as you know, Naruto has left the village. We haven't been able to track his exact location yet, however, I think he is still in the land of fire. We aren't sure where he's heading or if he even has a destination at the moment, however it is a very safe bet to say that he is heading to one of the other major ninja villages. The young man said looking at him. I see, and what of Danzo, what is he doing about all this? Surely he's not just sitting back and doing nothing about it. That just doesn't sound like something he would do. The elderly white-haired male said looking at the young male in front of him. Well, you're right about that. He earlier today ordered me to create some forged documents and hand them to Lord Hiruzen. These documents were enough to convince him that Naruto is now dead. However, this information is, in fact, false. Naruto is still very much alive as of our current information and Danzo wants him. The man said looking at him. I assume he wants to make him a root soldier, Jiraiya said looking at him. Yes, however, he doesn't want to make him just any member of root. He wants to make him a special sleeper agent. The young man said looking at him. Sleeper agent? Jiraiya asked looking at him. Why would he want to make him a sleeper agent? He asked looking at him. I'm not entirely sure, to be honest. Even with his inner circle he has been very secretive about his current plans. Although if I had to take a guess, he wants to make Naruto a sleep agent so he can attack Konoha and then activate Naruto. Naruto would live a normal life not knowing a thing until it happened, then he would just suddenly turn on them. However, I cannot confirm any of this. So at the moment I guess you could say that all this is nothing more than just a hunch that I have. The man said looking at him. I see. Well, thank you for the information, you can leave now, Jiraiya said looking at him. When he said this the man nodded and walked out of the building. Jiraiya then sighed and picked up the bottle of sake he had put down. I'll think more about it later. As for now, Satsuki, I'm free again, he said calling out to the female. With Naruto, the blonde was currently holding the fox known as Kitsune in his arms. Great kid, you found your pet, now let's go before I get a lecture about not bringing you to the office immediately. The man said looking at him. Naruto nodded and followed the man. They walked through the woods and came to a clearing. When they did, Naruto saw a massive waterfall with a rather large lake that formed around it in front of him. However, he was a little surprised to see that there was a small boat on the edge of the lake. He was even more surprised when he watched the man get on the boat. Well, what are you waiting for? We don't have all day, the man said looking at him. To which Naruto ran up to the boat saying a quick apology. When he was in, the fox followed behind him and sat on his lap. The man then started to make his way towards the waterfall, but as he did he couldn't help but find himself staring at the fox that was on Naruto. You know kid, that's a little weird to be honest, he said looking down at the blonde in front of him. What is? Naruto asked a little confused. The fact that you have a pet fox. You said that it just bonded with you in the short time span of one day. Most foxes never form bonds with people unless they are born and they grow up with people. Yet here you are with a wild fox sleeping on your lap. It's just a little unsettling is all, the man said looking at him. Really? Naruto asked, looking at the male in front of him. He then thought about it and realized that all his life he had never seen a fox inside Konoha. He had no idea why that was, but he did recall someone making a call once because a fox was spotted in the park. He avoided the park for the rest of the day because he recalled in a magazine once that foxes are extremely dangerous and can cost people their lives. I guess you're right, it is a little odd now that I think about it, Naruto said, looking at him. The taller figure said nothing as he walked in front of the boat and used a stick to bring the boat to a stop just before it met the waterfall. He then put his hands out in front of him and flashed through a series of hand signs. When he did, Naruto saw a blue symbol appear on his hand as well as something that made his eyes grow in amazement. The waterfall began to part. The water was literally splitting open right down the middle, revealing a huge village behind it. How did you do that? Naruto asked, looking at him. You'll understand in a few weeks, kid. I'm sure you'll find out one way or another, the man said as he took the paddle and pushed the boat through the waterfall. When he made it through, he once again used the paddles to stop the boat and stood where the waterfall used to be. He then, like before, flashed through a series of hand signs and a symbol on his hand appeared and the waterfall began to close. After it did, the man from before once again grabbed the paddle and once again began to go towards the village. As they were heading, Naruto realized something, so he turned to the man in front of him. What village is this exactly? Naruto asked, looking at him. Isn't it obvious, kid? The elderly man asked, looking at the small blonde in front of him. Naruto then scratched the back of his head sheepishly and looked at him. Not really, he said, looking up at the taller man. When the elderly man heard this, he sighed and looked at the small child in front of him. Well, we're in Takigakure, the taller figure said, looking at him. Really? But Takigakure, that's in the land of water. Naruto said, looking at him. Well, yeah, where else would it be? What's the matter, kid? You look like you've seen a ghost. The man said, looking down at him. I'm in the land of water. I'm in the land of water. I somehow got to the land of fire to the land of water in one day. How did this happen? Naruto thought as he looked down at the fox in front of him. However, he was brought out of his thoughts as he felt the boat come to a stop. He then looked and saw the man in front of him already off the boat. Come on, I need to take you to see Shibuki. He's the one that will decide whether or not you get to stay. The man said, looking at him. Naruto then nodded and started to follow behind the male in front of him. As they were walking down the streets, Naruto saw a bunch of people. However, he noticed something that made him rather happy. None of these people were glaring at him, they were smiling at him. Their eyes weren't filled with hate, no one was whispering behind his back. They just looked happy to see him. However, as they were walking down the street, a female landed in front of him. She had long blonde hair that came down to her hips and light blue eyes. Who's this Zero? She asked, looking at the male in front of her. Just a kid I found in front of the village. He says he wants to join, so I'm taking him to see Shibuki. The man said, looking at the female in front of him. She then sighed and looked at him. No, you're going back to the front gates to patrol the village. I'm taking him to see Shibuki. The girl said, looking at him. Look, I found this kid and his pet fox and plan to take full responsibility for him. Now let me go take him to Shibuki so he can become an official citizen of Takigakure. The male said, looking at him. Either you leave or I tell Shibuki that you've been drinking on your patrols again. The female said, looking at him. Alright, easy now, no need to get hostile. Look, if taking the kid to Shibuki means that much to you, then I'll let you take him, he said, looking at her. It does now leave and get back to patrolling the village. The female said, looking at him with a smirk of victory on her face. As she watched the man walk away, she looked at the young blonde in front of her. Alright, little guy, so what's your name? She asked, looking at him. My name's Naruto, Naruto Uzumaki, the blonde said, looking at her. Naruto, an odd name, but I like it, she said, looking at him. Thanks, I guess, Naruto said, looking at her. So where's your parents, little guy? She asked, looking at him. When she asked this, she saw the young boy get visibly upset. I never knew my parents, Naruto said, looking at her. Oh, sorry, well, who takes care of you? Is your aunt, or uncle, or maybe your grandparents here with you? She asked, looking at him. Naruto then hung his head down and nodded his head side to side as a response. I've never had any family. It's always been me, or I should say it's always just been me, he said, looking at her. When he said this, the older female felt a little bad for the male in front of her. Alright, well, let's take you to see Shibuki, the blonde said as she stood to her full height and began to walk down the street. As they did, Naruto saw a large tree in the middle of the village. What is that? Naruto asked, looking at the large. I'll explain later, but to put it simply, that's where everything important is. We built our base of operation into that large tree, she said, looking at him. When Naruto heard this, he turned his head sideways and looked at her. Why would do that? What if there's a fire? Naruto asked, looking at her. Well, that's just the thing, because the tree has a large lake on the other side that most people can't see, that leaves a lot of water for our water specialist to work with, she said, looking at him. However, we are careful to avoid something like that from happening. We wouldn't want something like that happening to our base, she said, looking at him. Oh, I see. Well, that's kind of cool, I guess, Naruto said, looking at the female in front of him. Yeah, I guess it is a little neat, she said as her and Naruto approached the large tree. As they did, Naruto noticed that door was made of metal. As she opened it, Naruto got a little nervous. Alright, let's go. We wouldn't want to keep Shibuki waiting now, would we? She said as she walked in. When she did, Naruto followed close behind her and the three headed up the steps. Once they came in front of the door, she stopped and looked at Naruto and the fox that had been following behind him. Alright, well, first off, do you mind leaving your fox out here? Shibuki gets scared kind of easily, the female said, looking at him. No, I guess not, Naruto said as he turned to the small animal. Kitsune, mind waiting out here for me while I talk to Shibuki? Naruto asked, looking at the small creature. The fox then walked over to one side of the door and circled several times before it let out a loud yawn and started to sleep. Naruto then looked at the blonde female in front of him and walked in behind her. When he did, he saw a teen with black hair sitting behind the desk. Shibuki, we have someone here who wants to become a citizen of the village, the female said, looking at him. Oh, I see. Well, can you leave us for just a moment? Shibuki asked, looking at the female in front of him. When he asked this, the female nodded and left the room. So, my young friend, why do you want to join my village? He asked, looking at him. Well, where I used to live, no one liked me, so I left. I left because I want to be somewhere where people are happy to see me. I want to be somewhere where there isn't always a struggle for me to buy something to eat. I want to be somewhere where I actually feel wanted. I left with nowhere in mind and I just came across here by accident. Naruto said, looking at the teen figure in front of him. Shibuki nodded at this. Alright, I can see that. Well, my new friend, just tell me your name and who else is here with you and you can become an official member. Shibuki said, looking at him. My name is Naruto Uzumaki, but I didn't come here with anyone. Well, no one expect my pet Kitsune, Naruto said, looking at the male figure in front of him. When Shibuki heard this, he looked at Naruto a little curious but shrugged it off all the same. Alright, well, Naruto, seems like we're all set, so just go around town and I'll leave you to your own devices, Shibuki said, looking at him. When the young blonde heard this, he smiled and turned around, walking out of the room. When he did, he was greeted with the fox looking at him. Looks like we got a new home, Kitsune, Naruto said, looking at the fox. The fox yipped happily and started to walk down the stairs. Yeah, good idea, Kitsune, let's see what the village looks like, Naruto said as he followed behind the small animal. When he exited the building, he smiled and began to walk around with Kitsune close behind him. He wasn't really looking for anything in particular, however, as he was walking he found himself slowly making his way to the park. When he got there, he smiled. It had a lake in it just like the park in Konoha did, but the only difference was that people weren't trying to drown him in this one. As he walked around, he started to feel a little sad. However, like last time, there was a reason why. As he looked around, he saw that everyone had a family. The people that were doing it didn't mean to make him sad, but they were. Naruto soon found himself walking down the sidewalk that was along the lake. He soon saw that there was a dock there just like Konoha. He walked to the end of it and looked at his reflection in the water. Here he was in an entirely new village, and yet he felt the same way he did when he left. However, his frown soon faded as the reflection of a fox appeared next to him. He then looked to his side and placed his hand on the small fox's head. Well, nice to know that this wasn't for nothing. At least I'll have you by my side now, Naruto said, looking at small fox as he began to pet it. The fox let out a small yip as Naruto said this and crawled onto his lap. Naruto sighed when he saw this and began to pet the fox as he looked out at the lake. However, this came to an end as he heard footsteps behind him. He decided to ignore this, figuring it wasn't important. It was quite for a long time, so Naruto had figured that whoever it was had left. However, this thought was wiped from his head as he heard a voice speak behind him. Excuse me, but is that fox yours?" He heard a female voice ask behind him. He then turned his head to see a girl around his age standing in front of him. She had mint green hair and orange eyes that absolutely captivated Naruto. It was probably because orange was his favorite color. Yeah, his name is Kitsune," Naruto said looking at her. "Does he bite?" the female asked coming closer to him. "Well, he did bite me once but he hasn't done it since," Naruto said looking down at the fox. Oh, can I pet him?" she asked looking at him. "I don't see why not," Naruto said letting the girl he had just met come rather close to him. She then slowly reached down and placed her hand on the small creature's head. When she did, she smiled and began to slowly pet it. When she did, the smile from before spreading across her face. She then stopped when the fox let out a yawn and looked at the boy in front of her. "My name's Fu," she said holding out her hand. "Mine's Naruto," the blonde said taking the girl's hand. "Mine's Naruto," the blonde said reaching out his hand. The girl looked at it for a second before she smiled and took it. When she did, Naruto got up with a smile on his face. "Want to hang out?" he asked looking at her. When he asked this, the girl seemed a little shocked but nodded nonetheless. "Alright, cool, what do you want to do first?" Naruto asked looking at the female in front of him. She was quiet for a moment before she looked at him and smiled. "Let's just walk around town and then if we find something fun to do, how about we do that?" The green-haired female that Naruto now knew as Fu suggested looking at him. "Yeah, sounds great," Naruto said looking at her. The girl in front of him nodded when he said this and the two walked off the docks with the fox following closely behind the two of them. As the two walked down the streets, Naruto smiled as he followed alongside Fu. However, as he did, he noticed something rather odd. It was just an overall strange feeling he was getting. It was familiar and for whatever reason he didn't like it. As the two walked down the street, the blonde noticed that Fu had been quite so far, which meant that she too also felt whatever this feeling was. Naruto, being the curious young child he was, looked around and saw that everyone was staring at him like they used to. Their eyes were all filled with hate and disgust like before. He stayed silent for a couple more minutes and just listened, and he heard what he had heard all his life. They were all whispering behind his back. He then paid extra close attention to what they were saying. However, when he did, he noticed some key differences in what they were saying, some differences that made it very clear that they weren't talking about him. "There she goes again," he heard a female voice say. "Yeah, what a freak. It's no wonder her parents left her when she was a baby," he heard another female respond. "That stupid bitch has no place hanging out with that young man and corrupting his innocence," he heard a man say. It then became quite clear to him that they weren't talking about him. They were talking about the female that he was with. They were talking about Fu. He then looked around once again to look at the people that he was passing. He then noticed that their stares weren't directed at him. In fact, they seemed to almost completely ignore him and go straight to Fu. Naruto then looked at Fu as they stopped in front of a house. It looked a lot like the apartment that the Hokage had given him back in Konoha. "This is my home," Fu said looking at the blonde in front of her. A moment of silence fell behind them before Fu finally spoke up again. "I know it's not much to look at, but it's a place to call my home," Fu said looking at him. "I think it looks nice," Naruto said looking at her. When he said this, it brought a smile to the young female's face. "Would you like to come inside?" Fu asked looking at him. When she asked this, Naruto smiled and nodded. "Yeah, that sounds nice," Naruto said as he looked at her. Fu then walked forward and unlocked the door. She then went in with Naruto following close behind her. Naruto then turned around to look for Kitsune, but when he did, he found that no one was there. He looked around for a second before he heard Fu's voice call out to him. "Naruto, are you okay?" Fu asked looking at him. Naruto shrugged off the thought not being able to find Kitsune and turned around to look at Fu shutting the door behind him. However, if he had spent just a bit more time looking, he would have found that the fox he had come to know as Kitsune was just on the side of the house. It sat down and looked at its now fully healed paw before it let out a sigh. "You're one interesting kid. Not many people would help a wild animal. I guess my apology is good enough, and from what I can tell, it's been accepted. I took you to the land of water and gave you a new life and stayed with you until you found a new friend. I consider that good enough of an apology for biting you," the fox that Naruto knew as Kitsune said. He then placed his paw on the ground and some light blue chakra gathered around it before a complex design spread across the ground. "Naruto, huh? Well, you're kind-hearted, strong, and most importantly you seem to care for your friends. You meet almost all of the qualifications to become our new summon master. The only one you're missing is being an actual ninja. However, time can also change people. Let's see if you're still the same as you are right now in a few years or so. The fox said before he slowly walked over the design and disappeared in a puff of smoke, as well as the design also disappearing. However, Naruto was still currently inside the house, looking at how neatly kept everything inside was. Wow, Fu, this place is awesome. Your parents must be amazing at keeping this place clean, Naruto said looking at her. However, when he said this he saw Fu's face become slightly more pale. I don't live with my parents, the green-haired female said looking at him. Really, then is it your grandparents, or maybe you live with your aunt and uncle, Naruto said looking at her. However, when he said this she once again nodded her head. I live here all by myself, she said looking at him. Really? Naruto then became a little regretful as he started to realize just how similar the two of them were. She's all alone just like I was. Why is that? Does every village just have someone that they hate for no reason? Naruto thought to himself as he looked at her. What do I have something on my face? Fu asked, starting to feel around for anything that felt a little unusual. Naruto then blushed slightly as he realized that he had been staring at her this entire time. No, it's fine. I was just lost in thought was all, Naruto said looking at the female in front of her. Oh, okay then, Fu said as she sat down on the couch. Naruto then smiled and took the seat behind her. When he did, a few moments of silence passed. However, this silence was much more solid, thick than the others were. It was so thick in fact that not even a well-trained ninja could cut through it. After a minute had passed, it like before was Fu that broke the silence. You noticed it, didn't you? She asked looking at him. Noticed what? Naruto asked looking at the female that was beside him. You know the stairs. The stairs that the villagers were giving me when we were walking through town earlier today. Fu said, avoiding eye contact. Naruto tensed up as she said this, but then relaxed and looked at the ground in front of him from where he was sitting. Yeah, I did, Naruto said looking at her. What did you think about it? Fu asked, now looking at him slightly worried. Naruto was quiet for a moment before he finally spoke up. I think that they need to mind their own business. I mean, what does it matter what you're doing with me? It really bugged me, and frankly, they need to just back off, Naruto said looking at her. When he said this it brought a smile to the young girl's face. It was once again silent for a moment before Fu looked at him. Do you really mean that? She asked looking at him. Yeah, of course I do. Like I just said. Naruto didn't get to finish his sentence as he felt two arms wrap around him and embrace his figure tightly. When he felt this he tensed up. He wasn't used to such contact. The only one that he ever really had contact with was the third Hokage, and he never really hugged him. He was unsure of what to do right now, but he eventually relaxed his muscles and wrapped his arms around her and held her close to him. After a moment of hugging, Naruto once again heard Fu's voice. You're the first person to have ever said that to me. I really appreciate it, Naruto. Fu said looking at him. It was then quiet for a moment and Fu finally separated from him. If there's ever anything I can do for you, just let me know, Fu said looking at him. Naruto was quiet for a moment before he gave it some thought and realized something. He didn't have anywhere to live. This entire time of being here and traveling he never once thought about where he was going to live when he did finally find somewhere where the people didn't treat him like crap. Well, I don't exactly have anywhere to stay right now. So could you maybe help me find somewhere to stay? Naruto asked looking at her. When he asked this the green-haired female smiled and almost instantly said, you can live here with me. Fu yelled out much louder than she had meant to. I means that's only if you want to, of course, she said looking at him. Naruto then smiled when he heard this. Yeah, that sounds great, Naruto said looking at her. When he said this Fu smiled and looked at him. Great, now all we need to do is go and tell Shibuki that you'll be staying here with me. Since it'd be pretty awkward if you were to be accused of breaking and entering when you live here too. Fu said looking at him. Naruto nodded when he heard this and followed behind her as she left the building. As the two were walking down the streets, Fu noticed something rather odd. Hey, Naruto, where are your parents? Fu asked looking at him. When she asked this a moment of silence fell upon them but passed as soon as it came. Well, the thing is I don't really have any parents, I came here all by myself, Naruto said looking at her. However, as soon as he said this Fu felt regret almost immediately. She knows the pain of not having parents and how difficult it can be to talk about. Oh, I'm so sorry if I brought up some bad memories. Fu said looking at him. It's okay, there's really no need to apologize. I mean, I never had any parents or parental figures, so it's hard for me to really get mad about something that I wouldn't know anything about at someone who knew nothing about it. It just seems really silly, Naruto said looking at her. When he said this, Fu smiled and continued to walk down the street. When they once again arrived at the massive tree in the middle of the village, the two entered and Naruto once again noticed that the girl from behind the counter never left. Oh, hello, nice to see you again, Naruto, she said looking at the blonde. However, when her eyes fell upon Fu, her smile faded. I guess I should have known you'd come back here today, she said looking at Fu. The two went silent at this comment and walked up the stairs. Once they reached the top, Naruto knocked on the door in front of him and Fu. When he did, he heard a muffled voice say, "Come in." When the two heard this, they walked into the room. "Ah, Naruto and Fu, what can I do for the two of you?" the male asked looking at the two of them. "Well, I wanted to know if it was okay if Naruto came to live with me?" Fu asked looking at the teen in front of her. The teen then took a pose that suggested that he was thinking. He then looked at the blonde in front of him. "Are you okay with living with Fu, Naruto? If you are, then I can start on the paperwork right now, and once I get it finished, then you'll be able to live with Fu," the teen said looking at the young figure in front of him. When Naruto heard this, he smiled and nodded his head. "Yeah, I'd like to live with Fu. We have so much in common and I'm sure we'll get along great," Naruto said looking at the teen figure in front of him. The male then thought about it for a moment before he nodded and pulled out a new stack of paperwork. It wasn't very much, maybe 5 papers total. "Alright, well, if you two could wait just a moment while I get everything set up, then you'll be good to go," Shibuki said looking at them. The two then nodded and walked over to the side of the room and watched as he began to work on some paper. They watched as he began to slowly move the papers aside one by one. When he got to the last paper, he looked at the two young figures that were in front of him and smiled. "Alright, well, now all I need you two to do is sign this paper and then the two of you will legally be allowed to live together," the male said looking at the two young figures in front of him. However, when he said this, a figure wearing a black cloak with a cat-shaped mask walked into the room. "Who are you?" Shibuki asked looking at the strange figure in front of him. The man said nothing as he slowly walked forward and looked at the two small figures in front of him. Danzo said to obtain the one with spiky blonde hair and blue eyes, the male said as he reached for Naruto. "Whoa buddy, I don't know who you are, but you can't just come here and kidnap citizens that belong to my village," Shibuki said looking at him. However, as soon as the masked figure looked at him, Shibuki quickly hid behind the chair that was in front of his desk and began to push the panic button that was on the back of his chair. "You can't just take Naruto," Fu said looking at the tall figure in front of her. "I can and will, for I have been instructed to take him by any means that I find suitable for dealing with this situation," the man said looking at the small figure in front of him. The door to Shibuki's office then suddenly flew open. When the masked figure heard this, he dashed forward and grabbed Naruto. The strange figure then jumped out of the window of Shibuki's office. When he did, the 3 ninjas that had burst in ran over to Shibuki, that was at the moment still cowering behind his chair. "Lord Shibuki, are you alright?" one of them asked as he began to examine the man in front of him for cuts and bruises. "I'm fine, to make sure Fu alright, then sends out a search party to find whoever that man was and get Naruto back," Shibuki said. However, when he did, the ninja began to look around for Fu. They were surprised not to see her in the room. They looked around before they sighed and left the room. "We'll worry about Fu later, right now we have to make sure that no harm has come to Naruto," the male said before leaving the room. When he did, Shibuki sighed and got up before looking out the window. He saw no sign that the ninja had even been there other than the shattered pieces of glass on the ground. He then sighed and walked over to his desk and clenched his still racing heart. "I really don't think all this excitement suits me," he said as he looked at the small stack of paperwork that was on his desk. "I hope Naruto's okay," Shibuki said aloud as he began to once again do his paperwork. With Naruto, the young blonde was trying to yell at his current capture, but he had made sure this wasn't possible. He did this by stuffing a large ball of cloth inside the young blonde's mouth, then making sure he couldn't spit that ball out by wrapping another piece of cloth around his mouth. He also used a rather short rope to tie his hands. However, the male that was carrying the young blonde suddenly stopped. He then placed the young blonde in front of a fireplace. When he did, he saw another figure wearing a black cloak and like the other had a car mask on it. "What are you doing? We weren't supposed to get him until tomorrow," a female voice said behind the mask. "I know, but come on, the village's security was so bad, all I did was practically walk in and take him. Not to mention that they're probably too worried about that Shibuki fellow to have even followed me. I'd say that all in all I did a good job, and we can now return one day early than what we were supposed to," the male said, looking at the female figure in front of him. "Alright, whatever, but if we get in trouble again, this time, you're taking the blame and not me," the female said, looking at the male in front of her. The male nodded when he heard this and looked at the young blonde that at the moment was currently trying to escape. He then sighed and stood on the end of the rope that wasn't wrapped around the blonde's hands. "Kid, just give up, you're coming with us whether you like it or not," the male said, looking at him. When he said this, Naruto sighed and stopped struggling. The two adults that were in front of Naruto then began to talk to one another. However, as he sat there looking at them, he heard a rather odd noise. He looked around and saw a bush, however he then saw a shade of green that didn't match the rest of the bush's green color. Naruto smiled when he saw this, knowing only one person that hair could belong to, and soon enough his suspicion were confirmed as he saw a set of orange eyes and a rather familiar face. She then made a gesture that meant she wanted him to come over to her. However, Naruto knew that trying to go over there would prove to be pointless. So he just moved to the side and pointed at the ropes. When Fu saw this, she grew a little depressed, however she then heard what sounded like footsteps in the distance. She then smiled and disappeared, much to Naruto's distress. She then followed the sound she had heard and was happy when she saw a familiar face with long blonde hair that came down to the back of her knees, wearing a Takigakure headband. She then ran up to them and smiled. "Thank goodness you are here, you need to." Fu didn't get to finish her sentence as the blonde interrupted her. "Fu, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be this far away from the village, it's dangerous," she said, looking at her. However, she quickly remembered why she was out here in the first place. "Never mind that, we need to find someone who came to the village today. His name is Naruto, he has blonde hair and blue eyes, so keep a lookout for him. He was kidnapped for unknown reasons," the taller blonde said, looking at her. "That's what I wanted to tell you. I know where Naruto is, I followed the people that took him away out here," the green-haired female said, looking up at the girl that was currently in front of her. "What, really? Then show me where they are, that way I can gather my team and we can beat them up," the female said, looking down at the child in front of her. When she did, Fu nodded and walked over to the bush she had just left. However, when she got close to the bush she had been in, she got quiet and pointed to it. "They're just behind that bush," she said, looking at her. The tall blonde then nodded and walked past the bush, making herself known to her two enemies. When the two finally took notice of her, they rose up off the ground and looked at her. "Who are you and what do you want?" the male of the two asked, looking at her. "I am a shinobi of Takigakure and I have come to reclaim the citizen that you have stolen," she said, looking at the two members in front of her. When the two heard this, they got closer together and completely hid Naruto from view. "I'm afraid we cannot do that, miss. We are very sorry that you wasted the trip here. So if you don't mind, please leave," the female said, looking at her. "Well, I'm afraid that I cannot do that, so how about you just hand him over?" The girl was silenced as she felt a sharp pain in the back of her neck. As soon as she felt this pain, she knew what it meant and she could do nothing about it. She just sighed as she felt her body slowly fall towards the ground and watched as her vision faded to black. The third member that had been hidden until then stepped forward and looked at the two in front of him. "I think we should leave. If one of them knows our location, it's only a matter of time before the others figure out our location as well," the male said, looking at them. The two then nodded and the male walked over to Naruto. Fu's brain went into overdrive, thinking more than it ever had before. She wasn't sure what to do in this situation. She was about to lose her first real friend. The first person besides Shibuki that treated her like a human being and not some freak. The only person that asked if she wanted to be friends, the first person who wanted to be in her life. She wasn't sure what to do in the least, so she did the first thing that came to her mind. She stepped out of the bush she had been hiding in and yelled, "Wait!" She, of course, had not thought this through all the way, so when the three of them turned towards her, she was frozen in fear. "Seems as if we have found another one," the male who had just recently shown up said, stepping forward. "Daichi, I don't think that's a good idea. The girl in front of us is Fu. She is the Jinchuriki of Takigakure. Killing her would almost be as if we are asking for war, and we cannot afford a war with our organizations trying to stay hidden within our village," the female said, looking at the male that was in front of her. When he heard this, he turned to her. "Really now? Well, I guess you do make a good point. We can't afford a war at the moment. Then again, we cannot afford to just let her leave now that she knows we have Naruto," the male said, looking at her. He was then quiet for a moment before he looked over at the female once again. "What condition does Naruto need to be returned in again?" he asked, looking at her. "He just needs to be returned alive." "Why do you ask, Daichi?" the female said, looking at him. "Well, if she came all the way out here just to find him, then he's obviously important to her, right? From the way he was treated before, then roughing him up should be no problem. Not to mention, I'm sure that she will get the picture to not follow us," he said, looking at her. When he said this, she nodded and got behind Fu before she pinned her down to the ground and forced her head into a passion where she was looking straight in front of her. The leader of the three, which she had come to know was named Daichi, then brought Naruto in front of her and looked at her. "Listen, if you don't stop following us, then bad things are going to happen. Things like this," the male said as he drew his kunai from his holster and brought it to Naruto's throat. "This is the second time in one day I've had a kunai to my throat. Would give," Naruto thought as he felt the blade sink into his throat slightly. "Now do understand you to need to stop following us?" he asked, looking at her. "Why, yes, I understand. I'll stop following you," Fu said, looking at the male that was currently holding a blade to Naruto's throat. I don't think you do," the male said as he brought the blade down to Naruto's side. He then slowly brought the blade into his side. The sudden pain caused Naruto to wince and even let out a slight screech at the new source of pain to enter his body. Please stop," Fu said, looking at the male in front of her. Naruto's eyes started to slowly open as the pain subsided. However, this was short-lived as the male began to twist the kunai into the wound, causing Naruto to scream out slightly. Fu once again found herself at a loss of what it was she was supposed to do, but for whatever reason, even though she had never been in this situation before, she felt angry at what they were doing. "Do you understand now? If you continue to follow us, his pain will only grow. I know for a fact that neither one of us want that, so how about you just turn around and go back to the village?" Daichi said, looking at Fu. He then took the blade out of his wound and slammed it into his knee. Fu felt her body suddenly heat up with anger as she saw him do that, and something inside of her just snapped. "I said stop it," Fu said as she suddenly felt a lot stronger than she had been before. She suddenly turned around to where she was facing the female that was holding her. She then jumped up and moved her body to where her feet were at her captor's chest. She then kicked her opponent with all the foche she had, which sent both her and her opponent back. This caused the girl to let out a pained scream. When she did, she let out the scream much louder than intended, and this, of course, caused the surrounding ninja to hear. When a certain male that Naruto had met in the morning heard the scream and wasted no time in rushing over to where the scream had come from. "Who could be all the way out here? I know we had a visitor earlier today, but this is ridiculous. I just hope that if it's the people that took Naruto, that Naruto is alright," the male thought as he dashed through the trees. However, when he got there, he came across an unexpected situation. There were 3 confirmed enemies, however each one of them was on the ground and covered in blood. He then saw Fu looking rather closely at a wound on Naruto's side. "Naruto, is it alright? It doesn't hurt, does it?" Fu asked as she reached out for the wound that was on his side. "Yeah, it's fine, Fu, it doesn't hurt anymore," Naruto said, looking at her. "Well then, how about the one on your leg, is it alright? Are you able to stand up?" Fu asked as she looked at him. "It hurts a little bit, but I'm sure the pain will go away," Naruto said, looking at the female in front of him. When he said this, Fu let out a sigh and looked at him with a smile. "That's good, well let's go home, Naruto," Fu said as she got up. When she did, she offered Naruto a hand up and he took it with a smile. What happened here?" the male asked as he looked at the two in front of him. "You should have seen it, Fu was awesome. She kicked all of their butts and they were all freaked out, saying something about seal or something like that. But it was just awesome, man, you really should have seen its furs," Naruto began, and his little rant would have continued if the half-drunken man hadn't put a stop to it. Alright, that's enough, I get the idea." He then took a rather large drink of a bottle of sake that he had with him and looked at the two in front of him. "Well, you two, I was supposed to make sure Naruto was safe, and other than a few minor injuries he looks to be just fine, so let's head back to the village," the man said, watching as the two of them walked by. The two children then nodded and walked away. The elderly man then heard some rustling and looked to his side to see the girl he had met up with earlier that day. When she came to, she looked around and spotted the man. Where are the kids? She asked, looking at him. They're on their way back to town, the male said, looking at her. It wasn't until just now that she noticed the bodies on the ground. What happened? She asked, looking at him. The elderly man then sighed and offered her a hand up, knowing exactly what had happened. I'll explain when we get to Shibuki's office. He's gonna need to hear this too, he said as he helped her up. When she got up, she dusted herself off and the two began to move through the trees. As they did, they passed over Naruto and Fu. When the two saw two blurs pass over them, they both got a little nervous. Let's speed up just a little bit, Fu suggested, looking at Naruto. Why, yeah, sounds good, Naruto said as the two of them started to run towards the village. As they got there, Fu sighed and looked at Naruto. Now let's go make sure that Shibuki is alright, she said, looking at him, to which she received a nod. However, as the two were walking, Naruto had a rather strange thought. Hey Fu, why do we need to go check on Shibuki? I mean, I know he leads the village and all, but you were there when the other ninja came into the room, so you should know whether or not he is alright, Naruto said, looking at her. I didn't wait to see if he was okay. When I saw them take you away, my first reaction was to run after you, Fu said, looking at the blonde. Oh, okay, well, thanks, Naruto said, looking at her. When he did, Fu looked at him a little confused. For what? I really didn't do anything, Naruto asked, looking at her. Didn't do anything? You saved my life, Fu. You did something for me that I'm not sure anyone else would have, Naruto said, looking at her. Oh well, in that case, you're welcome, Fu said, looking at him as the two once again reached the huge tree that was in the middle of the town. When the two arrived in the office, Shibuki looked at them with a serious expression on his face. Naruto, Fu, I need to talk to the two of you, Shibuki said, looking at the two of them. When he said this, the two that were also in the room with him left and shut the door behind them. Please sit down, Naruto. I have something to tell you about what you saw tonight. When he said this, Naruto nodded and got a seat. Fu, however, became nervous and stood there for a moment before she also took a seat. Well, Naruto, about what you saw tonight, about what happened with Fu, Shibuki started, however, came to pause seeing that Fu was nervous and also shaking. No, first off, Naruto, I want to tell you some things first so that you better understand the situation, Shibuki said, looking at them. Oh, okay, well, what is it? The blonde asked, looking at him. First off, what I am about to tell you should not change what you think of Fu in any way. I want you to try and think of her the same way you did before I told you this, and if you do think of her differently, then I want you to promise that you will remain her friend, Shibuki said, looking at the blonde in front of him. Of course, I'd always be Fu's friend, she's a great person, Naruto said, looking at the teen figure in front of him. Alright, well, that's good to hear. Now I have something else I would like to tell you before I continue any further. Naruto, if you put a tiger inside a cage, what happens to the cage? Shibuki asked, looking at the blonde in front of him. When he asked this, Naruto was quite trying to think of a possible answer. Upon his silence, Shibuki smiled and looked at him. That's right, Naruto, nothing happens. Now sometimes the tiger is able to escape the cage and some bad things happen, however, does this make it the cage's fault that the tiger escaped? Shibuki asked, looking at the blonde in front of him. I don't think it would. I mean, blaming a cage for something that the tiger did just seems a little stupid if you ask me, Naruto said, looking at the male in front of him. Exactly. Now, Naruto, about what you saw tonight, what happened with Fu is similar to the cage and the tiger situation I just explained, Shibuki said, looking at the blonde in front of him. Alright, but how so? Naruto asked, looking at the teen figure in front of him. Well, Naruto, you see, Fu is what is called a Jinchuriki. Do you know what that is, Naruto? Shibuki asked, looking at the young male in front of him. When he nodded, Shibuki sighed and looked at him. Well, Naruto, a Jinchuriki is what someone is called when they have one of the tailed beasts sealed inside of them, Shibuki said, looking at them. So Fu has a tailed beast sealed inside of her? Naruto asked, looking at the teen in front of him. When the male nodded, Fu slowly lowered her head. She knew what she was, and she also knew that it was because of this thing inside of her that almost no one in the entire village liked her. She had expected him to be afraid of her or for him to hate her like the others, however, she didn't expect what came out of his mouth next. And you think this would make me think differently of Fu because? He asked, looking at Shibuki. The two were surprised but happy at what they had just heard. I guess you really aren't like the others, huh, Naruto? The male said, looking at the young blonde in front of him. Well yeah I guess so, Naruto said looking at them. Well that's all I really had to tell the two of you so the two of can go to your home, Shibuki said looking at the two of them. When he said this the two of them smiled and headed home. When the two got there Naruto had just thought of something that he hadn't until just now. Hey Fu, where am I going to sleep? Naruto asked looking at the female in front of him. With me in my bed, of course, she said looking at him. With you? Naruto asked a bit confused. He may not have known much in boys and girls, but some of what he did know were what was and wasn't supposed to be normal, and from what he knew a girl and a boy sleeping together wasn't normal. Isn't that a little weird? Naruto asked looking at the green-haired female in front of him. She looked confused for a moment before she actually began to think about. No, I don't think it's weird. I mean girls sleep with other girls all the time at these things called sleepovers, so what's wrong with a boy and a girl doing the same thing? Fu said looking at the blonde in front of her. Naruto then thought about it and couldn't really come up with an answer. I guess you're right, Naruto said as he followed Fu up the set of steps that was inside the apartment. The two then looked at the bed that was in front of her and each crawled into one side of the bed, each being back to back. However, neither one of them could sleep, they were both too caught up in their own mind to sleep. I can't believe how close I was to losing my new friend. To make matters even worse, I had to use that demon's power to save him. I want to help him, but I don't want him to be afraid of me. What could I do to make sure that no one ever hurts him like that again? Fu thought, however, after she had put some thought into it, she had come up with an answer. I'll become a ninja of Takigakure. If I did that, then no one would mess with Naruto again because they would know that I could save him. She thought as she let out a tired yawn at the end. I can't believe how weak I am. Fu had to come in and save me because of how weak I was. I left Konohagakure because I was tired of being a burden to everyone. I don't want Fu to spend her entire life protecting me because I'm too weak to do it myself. I could always become a ninja of Takigakure. If I did that, then Fu wouldn't have to protect me as much as she does now. Naruto thought to himself with a small smile gracing his face as heard Fu yawn. The two of them could feel their sleep winning the battle, and before the two drifted off into the lands of dreams they both had the exact same thought. I want to become a ninja so I can protect my new friend. After the two had thought this, the two slowly drifted off to sleep. Shibuki sighed as he looked at the massive amount of paperwork in front of him. Why is it that every year more and more kids want to become a shinobi? The teen asked out loud as he looked at the paper in front of him. He then heard a knock on his door and smiled. Come in, the teen said as he was looking at the door. When he did, he saw a male with a giant scar in the shape of an X on his face come into the room. Shibuki, I have some things that I would like to discuss with you, he said looking at the male in front of him. Alright, but aren't you supposed to be teaching the students down at the Shinobi Academy? Shibuki asked looking at him with a rather concerned look. No, not today, Satsuki is taking them on a field trip to show them the hero's water, the male said looking at the teen in front of him. Alright, well then what is it that you want to talk about? Shibuki asked looking at the male in front of him. Well, it's a few different things actually, the male said looking at Shibuki. Okay, well, what are they? Shibuki asked, just slightly annoyed with his counterpart not answering him. Well, most of them are about Naruto, the male said as he grew just a little bit nervous. What about Naruto? Shibuki asked looking at him. Well, first off there's that attack from 3 months ago. It's obvious that they had no other intention other than capturing Naruto. Now I and a few of the other shinobi have been talking and we think we might know why that is, the male said as he pulled out some papers he had put inside his coat. They hadn't fallen out of his coat on the way to the tree because he had used his chakra to make them stick to the surface of his jacket. Take a look at these, he said as he placed the papers down in front of the teen. Shibuki nodded and picked up the papers. Most of them were nothing more than information about students at the Shinobi Academy. However, he then came across the file of Naruto and the file of Fu, both of which had a red circle around them, more specifically their chakra levels. Shibuki noticed that there were some boxes that weren't shaded and one that was. The ones that weren't shaded read very low level, mid-level, intermediate level, and high level. The one box that was shaded in, however, read very high level. However, upon closer investigation, Shibuki noticed that Naruto's name also had a red circle around it. Please explain, Shibuki said looking at the male in front of him. Well, I'm not sure how familiar you are with chakra, but kids around Naruto's and Fu's age usually have low-leveled chakras, sometimes mid-level if they belong to a clan. So these two having a very high level of chakra is unusual to say the least, the male said looking at him. I see, so is this a mistake or is there some sort of explanation for this? Shibuki asked, now genuinely interested in what the male in front of him had to say. Well, the explanation for Fu having a high level of chakra is simple, it's because she's a Jinchuriki. Jinchuriki naturally have high levels of chakra because of the biju that is sealed inside of them. So once you find out that Fu is a biju, it really isn't that strange for her to have a high level of chakra, seeing as how the biju are creatures that are made out of pure chakra, the male said looking at the teen in front of him. Alright, so what's Naruto's excuse? The teen asked looking at the ninja in front of him. When he asked this, the male sighed. Well, that took a bit of digging for me to figure out, but I think I have the reason as to why his chakra level is so high, the male said looking at Shibuki. Then please enlighten me, the younger of the two said. Well, it has to do with his last name Uzumaki. The male said looking at the teen in front of him. When he saw that his leader had a confused look on his face, he sighed and decided to explain. That's right, I had forgotten you weren't there. Well, when your father ran the village, we would receive a visit from a clan. They would come here to relax, buy a few souvenirs, then leave. This clan was known as the Uzumaki clan. The male said looking at him. I see, so this Uzumaki clan is where Naruto is supposed to be right now? The teen asked. No sir, they suffered a major blow some years back and all of them were presumed to be dead. Seems like we may have the only Uzumaki left. The elder male said looking at the teen figure in front of him. I see, so what makes you think his clan has to do with any of this? Shibuki asked leaning forward slightly. Well, the last group that came through here allowed us to conduct some basic tests on one of their younger members. Believe it or not, she was actually around Naruto's age when we conducted these tests on her. The male said looking at his leader. Her? Shibuki asked with a brow raised looking at the male in front of him. Yes sir, it was a young woman named Kushina Uzumaki. She had a chakra level that is equal to Naruto's. Since this is really all we have to go on, I came to the conclusion that Uzumakis have a naturally high level of chakra. As to whether this is true or not can't be confirmed. The male said looking at him. I see, speaking of Naruto, how is he adjusting? Shibuki asked looking at the male in front of him. I'm not sure no shinobi will take the mission, the main reason being who he's living with. However, it doesn't seem to be good. Some of the villagers have figured out that Naruto and Fu live together and are now transferring some of their hatred over to him. Then on the same level, he seems to be adjusting rather well. The male said looking at him. That's good to hear. How are they doing when it comes to food supplies and clothing as well as the other basic essentials? Shibuki asked looking at the older figure in front of him. They're doing just fine in that department. Since most of the store owners won't sell food to Fu because she's a Jinchuriki, she takes the money that we give her and gives it to Naruto. He then takes the money and buys everything that they need to live for the next month. I'm a little surprised that he actually gets food that healthy instead of just buying a bunch of junk food. The male said looking down at the smaller figure in front of him. Well, he did come here alone and stated that his parents had no role in his life. So maybe it's not so strange to think that he learned how to cook for himself. Shibuki said looking at him. I see, that is also very strange. I can only imagine that the ones that attempted to kidnap Naruto have either already kidnapped his parents or that he took it a step further and actually killed his parents, knowing that obtaining him would be a much easier task than obtaining a full-grown adult. The elderly man said, brushing some hair out of his way. Yes, that seems to make sense. Speaking of which, how close are the three of them to cracking? The teen asked looking at him. When he asked this, the male sighed and looked at him. Not any closer than we were 3 months ago, and as this morning, we only have one prisoner left. The male said looking at the teen in front of him. What do you mean there's only one left? Shibuki asked looking at him. Well, we know how you can be about these type of matters, so we tried to avoid giving you the information until we were finished with them. We know that you aren't the type that would approve of our more effective methods, so we were going to wait until as long as possible to tell you about the interrogation. The male explained looking at Shibuki. I see, well, what became of the other two? Shibuki asked looking at the elderly man in front of him. Well, we started off with all the usual treatments and no signs of anything really were shown. They each showed no signs of fear or regret. Hell, they didn't even show signs of feeling any pain when we jabbed superheated kunai into their sides. As a result, we ended up accidentally killing one of them. The male said, looking at the teen in front of him. I see, well, that's rather disturbing. So what happened to the other? Shibuki said, looking at the male in front of him. Well, we found out something rather interesting last night. The remaining 2 ninja have a powerful genjutsu placed on them. So to be sure our reports were correct, we did several tests on the deceased body and it also had the same genjutsu placed on it. When we found this out, we spent all night debating on whether or not to release the genjutsu placed on one of the surviving men. The elder male said, looking at Shibuki. So I'm assuming that you all came to the conclusion that you should release him, Shibuki said, looking at the male. That correct. However, when we managed to get the genjutsu undone, something unexpected happened. The man's heart just completely stopped working and it exploded inside his chest. I've never seen a genjutsu that had that type of effect on someone before. Meaning that wherever they came from they saw this situation and prepared in advance. The male said, looking at Shibuki, who was still sitting in his chair. So we basically have a zombie in the torture department that you don't know what to do with, Shibuki said, looking at him. That is correct, sir, and as much as I know you hate having to make decisions like this, I'm going to have to ask you to make one of those choices. I need you to decide what we do with him, whether we kill him or keep him locked up. We need a decision as soon as possible. The male said, looking at Shibuki. When he said this, the teen tensed up and was quiet for a moment. He's right, I do hate having to make choices like this. Deciding whether someone lives or dies, something about making that call just doesn't feel right. Shibuki thought to himself. Sir, we need a decision, the male said, looking at Shibuki. After a few more moments of silence passed, Shibuki finally spoke. Put him to death by lethal injection, Shibuki said, looking at him. When the male heard this, he nodded and walked out of the room. After he had left, Shibuki let out a sigh and continued to do his paperwork. All things considered, I feel like I made the right choice. Letting him go is clearly not an option, and if we release the genjutsu he'll die anyway, so, at least, this way he won't feel any pain. Shibuki thought to himself as he looked at the paperwork. In Konoha, the elderly man who watched over the village looked down at his desk. He had just finished the last proportion of paperwork that he had to do before the day was over. He sighed, feeling relieved knowing that he had finished much earlier today than he had in a long time. However, his relaxed feelings soon came to an end as he heard someone knock on his door. Come in, he said as he straightened himself. However, the visitor he received was not one he had expected to receive, or at least not one he had expected to see anytime soon. The figure that emerged was none other than one of his former students. He had long white spiky hair and an aged face, as well as a giant scroll on his back. Hello, Hiruzen, the male said as he entered the room. Oh well, hello Jiraiya, I see that Father Time has been most kind to you. The elder of the two said as he looked at his former student. Yeah, he has, and I can see that he has done the same for you, the white-haired toad sage said as he looked around the room. Is something wrong? Hiruzen asked, looking at the elderly male in front of him. No, I'm just fine, the toad sage said as he approached his former teacher. He then pulled out a notepad and a pencil. So I was thinking it's been a while since we had done some student-teacher bonding, so I thought tonight we'd go out and catch up. What do you say? Jiraiya said as he wrote on the paper. When he was done, he passed the note to Hiruzen. The old man looked at it for a second before he picked it up and read the contents of the note. Your office is bugged, it's not safe to speak here. Let's move to a new safer location. I have some news that isn't for the ears of our listener. When Hiruzen saw this, his eyes widened slightly and he looked at Jiraiya a little surprised. Yes, I would love to go out for drinks tonight. Will anyone else be attending this event with us? Hiruzen said, looking at Jiraiya. Yes, although it's just Kakashi, the white-haired male said, looking at the elder figure in front of him. Really, why's that? Hiruzen asked, looking at his student. When he did, Jiraiya turned the piece of paper over and began to write once again. He's an old friend of mine. We met one day at a book signing and he brought a copy of ICHA Paradise for me to sign. Jiraiya said, looking at him. However, what he wrote on the piece of paper was entirely different. He's encountered the enemy we are going to discuss. It was years ago, but I believe that he may still have valuable information that we need. Hiruzen nodded at this and then said, Alright, sounds good, so where should we meet up? The elder man asked, looking at the younger male in front of him. Let's meet up at your house, Jiraiya said, looking at him, but once again wrote down something different. We're going to meet at my house at 7. I already checked both your house and Kakashi's house and both of them are bugged as well. My house is the only one that hasn't been infected yet. Alright, well, it's decided. What time should we meet up? Hiruzen asked looking at him. We'll meet up at 8, Jiraiya said, and once again the note held something different. We'll meet up in an hour, then again at 8, that way it looks like we really did go out to talk and catch up. Hiruzen nodded at this and Jiraiya smiled. Alright, sounds good, I'll see you then, Hiruzen said looking at the white-haired male figure in front of him. He then watched as the toad sage walked out of the room. So I have some people that are using the information they have obtained from me for their own personal gain? Well, that certainly would explain a few things, however, this is also very disturbing at the same time. I've come here into my house every day and it's unsettling to know that someone has been in both of them without my permission. The elderly man thought as he looked around. He then moved a massive amount of chakra to his eyes so he could locate the seals that had been placed in his room. He saw 5 pieces of paper placed in different locations in the room. One the ceiling, one beside the door, one on a wooden part of the window frame, one on the floor, one on the wooden chair, and the final one was right beside the pile of paperwork he had just finished. When he saw this, he just sat there quietly trying to think of some way he could remove all of the tags from the room. However, in his little fantasy he lost track of time, and when he once again looked at the clock he saw that it was close to the time that he was supposed to meet Jiraiya. So he calmly got up and walked out of the room. When he did, he took a left and went into the bathroom. Once he was in there he let out a sigh and used the shunshin to get to the house undetected. Jiraiya was little surprised to see his room fill up with smoke, however his confusion soon passed as he saw the elderly figure he had come to respect in the middle of it. Using the shunshin to get here, that way no one knows you're missing. Smart move. Then again, what else would I expect from the very man who trained me? The white-haired toad sage said looking at the elderly male figure in front of him. Hiruzen smiled when he heard this and looked at the younger figure in front of him. The two's thoughts then came to an end when they heard a knock on the door, however before either one of them could say anything, the masked figure known throughout Konoha as the copy ninja walked into the room. Yo, what's up? Kakashi asked looking at the two males. All good, now that you're here we can officially get started, Jiraiya said looking at the two male figures in front of him. When he said this the two of them nodded and took seat opposite of each other while Jiraiya was in the middle and off to the side. So what is it that Kakashi may or may not know about? Hiruzen asked looking at his former student. First things first, Hiruzen, how long do you think this has been going on? Jiraiya asked looking at the elderly man. When he asked this the great ninja didn't know how to respond and simply shrugged his shoulders before responding, a few years maybe. When the other two heard this they sighed and looked at the elderly man. I wish I could tell you that was the case, however the reality of the situation is not what we would like to believe, Jiraiya said looking at the male figure to his right. Indeed, as Jiraiya said, this has been going on much longer than just a few years. In fact, this conspiracy has been going on for close to 20 years, Kakashi said looking at the male in front of him. I see. Well, that is some rather alarming news, Hiruzen said as he put his head down for a moment trying to process the newfound information. After he had thought about it, he sighed and looked at the two men. Well, what all do we know? Hiruzen asked looking at the two men. Well, as you know, Danzo has his own version of the Anbu called the Root Agents, Jiraiya said looking at the eldest man in the room. Yes, of course, Hiruzen said looking at the two of them. To put it simply, these agents are not normal. Sure, they seem normal enough, and to an extent they are normal. Years ago they used to be normal humans that just undergone extreme training so that they were loyal to Danzo. However, as the years passed and as Danzo grew more and more paranoid, he had some of his researchers start working on a new genjutsu, one that doesn't just affect the mind, Jiraiya said looking at him, to which the elderly man's eyes grew wide with surprise. One that doesn't just affect the mind? How is that possible? Hiruzen asked looking at the two males in front of him. We don't know yet, but we do know that in order to perform the technique, two different people must be present during this. A genjutsu master and a fuinjutsu master must be the ones to perform the genjutsu, which is why it is so hard to detect in the first place, Jiraiya said looking at Hiruzen. I see, so Danzo intends to harm Konoha? Hiruzen asked looking at the two of them. It's hard to tell what his real motives are at the moment, however I am sure of one thing. He doesn't plan to harm Konoha, or at least not directly. He's not satisfied with his position on the civilian council and wants to be Hokage, Jiraiya said looking at him. I see, why would he want to be Hokage? Surely he could obtain the same results that he wanted just by taking it with brute force. Hiruzen said, looking at the males in front of him. After some time thinking about, I believe I have figured out why he is acting in secret instead of acting on impulse, Kakashi said, looking at the two elderly males in front of him. After a moment of silence, the copycat ninja finally spoke. If he were to take what he wanted by brute force, it would lead to several people fleeing. Some of the people that leave may end up in other ninja villages. If this happens, then they will without a doubt think that he is planning to do the same to their villages if he was willing to do it to his own. Kakashi said, looking at them. And if they found out about this, it would lead to another village or perhaps even several villages teaming up against Konoha to destroy him, Hiruzen said as he finally understood where Kakashi was going. Indeed, which needless to say would make the past 20 years of planning pointless, Kakashi said, looking at the male figures in front of him. Yes, that makes sense, however that still doesn't explain why he wants to become Hokage, Hiruzen said, looking at the two of them. That matter has a very simple answer, my friend. It's because the Hokage holds all the power, Jiraiya said, looking at him. The Hokage can manipulate certain factors to work out in his favor. The Hokage is the only one that can both make and terminate laws as they see fit. However, this is usually looked down upon because the civilian council usually add their input, Jiraiya said, looking at him. Yes, however the Hokage also has the ability to choose who is on the civilian council and who is to be rejected, so if Danzo were to become Hokage, Kakashi said, looking at the elderly figure waiting for him to see where he was going. He'd be able to make the civilian council members that have allied themselves with him, or even worse, he could make the civilian council people that he has placed under this new genjutsu he has developed, Hiruzen said, looking at them. Exactly, so you can see why at the moment you'll have to stay on your toes, Jiraiya said, looking at his former teacher. Yes, and I appreciate you telling me this, Hiruzen said, looking at them. When he said this, he got up and was about to shunshin away, however before he did, Jiraiya looked at him. Hiruzen, before you go, I just want you to know that no matter what you think at the moment, the civilian council are by no means your friends, Jiraiya said before the old man disappeared from the room. When he left the room, the silver-haired male looked at the toad sage. Why didn't you tell him that Naruto is still alive? The male asked, looking at the white-haired male. As much as it pains me to say this, leaving this village was probably the best thing Naruto could have done, Jiraiya said, looking at Kakashi. Oh, and why's that? Kakashi asked, looking at Jiraiya. Naruto left this village for a reason. While I'm not sure about the details, from what I gather from his last day here was just horrible. Now here's a question for you, Kakashi. If every day of his life was half as bad as that day was, why on earth would I tell Hiruzen? What good would it do Naruto? If I told Hiruzen, he'd just send more men out and bring him back to the village, he'd bring him back to a life that he hated. Why on earth would I want to sentence my godson to that kind of fate? Jiraiya asked, looking at the silver-haired figure in front of him. After a few moments of silence, Kakashi sighed in defeat and looked at the male in front of him. You're right, it wouldn't do him any good, Kakashi said, looking at him. The silver-haired male then got up and walked towards the door, but before he left he looked at the male that was still in the room. Then, at least, tell him when you think he can handle it. After all, he, unlike most of this village, did care for Naruto. He cared a lot more than anyone else did, so even if you don't tell him now, I believe he still needs to know the truth. Kakashi said as he opened the door and walked out into the streets of Konoha. Left alone to himself, the white-haired male sighed and began to think to himself. I guess it's true, if nothing else he doesn't have to learn the truth now, but he still deserves to know. I guess I can tell him when the time comes. When he, like me, understands that leaving this place was the best thing he could have done. It's almost kind of sad, really, if he had just had one friend, one person to take some of the weight that he had been carrying around with off his shoulders, he might not have left. Jiraiya thought as he looked at the ceiling. I wonder what he's doing now. Jiraiya asked in his head before he let out a long sigh. With Naruto and Fu, the two were standing in the hallway with two books in each hand. Their arms were perfectly extended and the two were starting to feel just a little sore. Why were they doing this? Because it was a punishment. Fu had asked a question in class, and seeing as how she was a Jinchuriki and a rather hated one in this particular village, she was sent outside. Naruto, being the young boy he is, tried to stand up for his newfound friend, and when he did, he was also ordered to stand outside the classroom. Stupid teacher, this doesn't even make any sense. Why is he having us do this? Naruto asked aloud in a slightly annoyed tone. It's fine Naruto, it's because I asked a question that I shouldn't have asked. It's my fault we're in this mess, Fu said looking down at the ground. When Naruto heard this he gritted his teeth and looked at her. How can she say this is her fault? It's not her fault, it's that stupid teacher's fault. I thought she had a good question, I didn't get what he was talking about either. They're treating her like they treated me. Naruto then found himself slightly depressed as he looked at Fu. Naruto then walked over to Fu and took the books from her hands and placed them on top of his own. Naruto, what are you doing? Fu asked looking at him. What's it look like? I'm going to carry your books for you, Naruto stated as he took her books and walked back over to his spot. Naruto, you don't have to do that, I can. Fu didn't get the chance to finish her sentence as Naruto interrupted her. Fu, it's fine, here's the way I see things. You don't deserve to be out here. You asked a question and I talked back to the teacher, I do deserve to be out here. It wouldn't be fair for you to get punished for something you didn't do, Naruto said looking at her. Fu once again looked as if she was going to say something, however, Naruto once again cut her off. Look Fu, I don't know how this village has been treating you and I don't care. As long as I'm around I'm going to try and make your life easier, Naruto said looking at her. Fu then looked at Naruto a little surprised before she nodded with a smile. Thanks, Naruto, the green-haired female said as she just sat there and watched him hold the books. He's so much nicer and more understanding than the others are. I wonder why that is. I guess it really doesn't matter, and Naruto, just as you're going to make my life easier I'll try my best to make yours easier as well, Fu thought as Shish. The blonde that had become well known throughout Takigakure as the demon lover, as well as many other names, let out a tired yawn as he rose from his bed. When he did he looked around and got up to his feet rather slowly. He then made his way over to the mirror that was in the room and looked down at the headband he had received yesterday. It was neatly folded just the way he had left it, but there was also a folded piece of paper beside it. The blonde reached down and unfolded it and his eyes slowly began to go over the words that were on the paper in front of him. I got tired of trying to wake you up, so when you read this you may want to hurry and get to the academy. Naruto's eyes widened at this slightly and looked around the room for the clock. When his eyes landed on the device that was hanging on the wall he darted to his closet and opened it up, throwing on his shirt and clothes in a hasty fashion, realizing that he only had 10 minutes before the teams were announced. When he realized this he quickly put on whatever pair of clothes he could find and started to run down the streets of Takigakure. Usually, him and Fu would be on the roofs, but seeing as how it was still early in the morning no one was on the streets just yet, and seeing as how the villagers tended to blame the two of them for pretty much anything, he didn't want to wake someone up then have to listen to them complain about it the rest of the day. When he arrived in front of the academy he saw that Fu was already there waiting for him in front of the massive building. It's about time you got here, the green-haired female said looking at him. I would have been here sooner if someone had woken me up like they said they would, Naruto said looking at the green-haired female. Like my note said, I tried to wake you up and you wouldn't. Also, I noticed that you were smiling in your sleep, so it didn't really feel right to wake you up from a dream that you were clearly enjoying, Fu said as the two of them walked into the classroom. Yeah, I don't really remember anything about the dream, but for whatever reason I just remember that it was a really nice dream, Naruto said as he looked at the green-haired female in front of him. Oh well, that's okay then. The two of them then stopped in front of the door where all the students that passed were supposed to meet up at. Fu then sighed and stepped forward. Let's just get this over with, Fu said as she turned back around to look at Naruto. The blonde then nodded at her and stepped forward. The two then stepped into the classroom, and when they did the two of them were almost instantly greeted with stares. Alright, now that the final two are here we can finally get started with team placement, the teacher said as he looked at the students in front of him. Naruto and Fu waited patiently for their name to be called, and each time the two of them grew more and more nervous hearing each team that was called out. What if I'm not on Fu's team? I somehow doubt that the other two that she gets paired up with will be as understanding as I am. Not only that, but then she'll have 3 people against her and not 1 person on her side. It'd make becoming a good ninja that much harder for her, Naruto thought to himself as he heard the male finish team placement for Team 6. The teacher continued to read off the names for the next team, and little did Naruto know that Fu had also started to worry about the exact same topic his mind was on at the moment. What if I'm not on Naruto's team? The others will defiantly take out a lot of their frustrations out on him because he hangs out with me. They'll do things to him that he doesn't deserve, and chances are that the sensei he gets will most likely also hate him because of me. They'll interfere with his performance and he won't ever advance past genin level, Fu thought to herself as the male in front of her continued to list Team 8. And finally, for Team 12 we have Naruto Uzumaki, Shiro Ito, and Fu. Your team shall be led by Goro Hachiro, the male said looking at the class. When he said this it made the two that had until now been worried about their team. The two of them then watched as several different older men and women came into the room announcing who they were and left with 3 newly announced shinobi. It eventually got to the point to where there were only 6 students left in the class. However, 2 familiar figures that Naruto recognized walked into the room. A man carrying a sake bottle in his hand and a woman with long blonde hair that came to the back of her knees. I'm just saying wouldn't be late if you didn't stop for another bottle of sake, the female said looking at the male in front of him. For the 100th time in the past minute, I'm sorry. I can't help it that this old body of mine has urges, after all, I'm only human, the male said looking at the female. Sorry for being late, I had to go and babysit this mess again, the blonde female said gesturing to the male that was beside her. The male sighed when he saw his counterpart do this and looked at the 6 students that were left. Well, I'm Goro Hachiro. Would the 3 of you that got placed in my squad please follow me, the man said as he walked outside. Fu and Naruto stood up and when they did they saw that a male in front of them had also stood up. They assumed that this was the 3rd member of their team. He had a pale complexion, snow-white hair, and blue eyes that seemed to remind the 2 of them of ice. The 3 of them followed their new instructor out of the academy building and down the streets of Takigakure. They stopped when they came to a place that none of the 3 recognized. The male walked into the building and the 3 followed closely behind him. Goro then sat down at a round table and the 3 younger figures sat in front of him. Well, let's get this over with. This is a mandatory exercise called Team Introduction. So go ahead, tell me about yourself, the male said as a waitress brought him a bottle of sake. The elder male looked at the bottle and sighed. He took a rather large drink of the bottle and then looked at the 3 in front of him. Why haven't you started yet? Goro asked looking at the 3 of them. Well, it's just we don't exactly know what to talk about, Shiro said looking at the elder figure in front of him. Basic information, you know what you like, what you hate, dreams for the future, hobbies, you know stuff like that, Goro said looking at the 3 of them. Mind giving us an example? Fu asked looking at the male. The male then sighed and looked at them. I suppose not. My name is Goro Hachiro. I like sake or pretty much any other alcoholic drink, to be honest. I'm not too fond of a certain blonde who's always on my case about tedious tasks. I guess I really don't have any dreams for the future, it's too much trouble to think about stuff like that. As for my hobbies, I guess it would be going to different bars and trying different types of drinks, the gray-haired male said looking at them. After a moment of silence, the white-haired male finally decided to speak up. Alright, I guess I'll go first. My name is Shiro Ito. I like being outdoors and certain types of manga. I hate a certain 2 people that live in this village as well as everything they've ever done. My plan for the future is to make their life a living hell, and as for my hobbies, I guess I don't really have any, Shiro said looking at the male in front of him. When Naruto heard this he clenched his fists and looked at the white-haired male. He's talking about me and Fu, and to make matters worse he does it right in front of us, Naruto thought to himself looking at the white-haired male. I'll go next, the blonde heard the green-haired member of his team say, which brought him back to reality. My name is Fu. I like people that treat others fairly, and I hate people who single others out and make them feel unwanted. My dream for the future is to have lots of friends and for everyone to see me for who I am, not what I am. As for hobbies, I guess I like training and going for walks, Fu said as she sat down. Okay, so that only leaves you, Goro said as he looked at the blonde in front of him. Huh? Oh right. Well, my name is Naruto Uzumaki. I like helping others and making people feel wanted. I hate people who have no respect for others as well as people who make others feel useless. My dream for the future is to help people realize that they're wrong for judging others because of their past or things that they can't control. As for my hobbies, I like spending time with my friends and I love eating new types of food, Naruto said looking at the male in front of him. Okay, those are relatively realistic goals, I guess. Well, tomorrow we're going to have our first training exercise. I want each of you to meet me at training ground number 14. I also wouldn't eat anything tomorrow if I were you, otherwise you'll have a bad time, Goro said looking at the 3 figures in front of him. Naruto was about to ask him a question, but before he could, the male in front of him disappeared in a cloud of smoke. As soon as he did, Shiro got up and looked at the two beside him. "I'll see the two of you tomorrow, I guess," he said as he walked out of the building. When he did, Naruto looked at Fu and the two of them walked out of the building. "Well, that was rather unexpected, don't you think?" Fu asked, looking at Naruto. "Which part, the training exercise or the part where Shiro insulted us in the most obvious manner?" Naruto asked, looking at the female beside him. "Oh, so you noticed that too, huh?" Fu asked, looking at Naruto. "How could I not notice it? It was as plain as day who he was talking about. It doesn't take a genius to figure out who he was talking about," Naruto said, looking at the female beside him. "Yeah, well, want to just go home then?" Fu asked, looking at Naruto. "Yeah, might as well, after all, we need to be ready for tomorrow," Fu said, looking at the blonde beside her. They then walked to the house that the two of them shared and got ready for the following day. When the two of them decided that they had everything that they needed, they walked into the rooms that the two of them had. As the two slowly drifted off into the land of dreams, they began to wonder exactly what the two of them would have to do. Then the two of them slowly fell into the darkness that was sleep. Then, like usual, Fu had woken up much earlier than Naruto had, and she went to take a shower. While she was in there, she remembered that she and Naruto, as well as the third member of their team, were supposed to meet up today. When she finally exited the bathroom, she put on her usual attire and walked to Naruto's room. She looked at the blonde and saw that, like the previous day, he was sleeping peacefully, but deciding that she wasn't going to be as nice today, placed her hands on his back and pushed him into the floor. With a solid thud, the blonde woke up and looked at the figure in his room. "What time is it?" Naruto asked, letting out a tired yawn. "Almost time for us to meet up with our team, so get ready," Fu said, looking at Naruto. The blonde got up and stretched when he heard this and walked toward his bathroom, where he took a shower and then came out. He then looked at Fu, who was standing by the door waiting for him. "Alright, you ready to go?" Fu asked, looking at the blonde in front of her, and when she did, she received a nod of the head. The two then began to walk down the street and arrived at a fenced-off area. When they did, the two of them jumped over the fence and began to walk into the field. Once they got there, they saw that the white-haired male was already there waiting for them. The two slowly walked over to him, and when they were about a foot away, Shiro got a little nervous, then looked at the two of them. The white-haired male began only to have gotten cut off by a sound that he was familiar with. When he heard this sound, him as well as the two that were in front of him jumped to the side and looked at where they were standing, only to see that there were several kunai in the ground where they were standing. The three of them pulled out a kunai and looked around. When they did, they saw a figure appear in front of them. This figure, however, made both Naruto and Fu very nervous. This figure was wearing a white mask that looked like a dog and had a leaf village symbol on the forehead. "I'd like for the three of you to come with me," he said, looking at them. "No way," Naruto said, looking at the male figure in front of him. "Well, I wasn't really giving you choice," the cloaked figure said as he ran forward, and the three that were in front of him also ran forward. Shiro was the first of the three to attack by throwing a kunai at the male. The male easily caught it and returned it to the white-haired male. Shiro jumped out of the way and looked at the male that Fu and Naruto were now locked in close combat with. The two of them tried repeatedly to land a hit on him but never could. However, the fight was short-lived as the masked figure jumped back slightly, causing the two figures in front of him to stop. When they did, he struck the back of their necks rather forcefully, and the two then hit the ground. Shiro looked at the figure that was in front of him and sighed. "Now it's your turn," the masked figure said, looking at him. Shiro threw his kunai on the ground and looked at the figure in front of him. "I give up," Shiro said, looking at him. "Oh, why the sudden change of mind?" the cloaked figure asked, looking at the white-haired male in front of him. "The three of us all had a chance of beating you, but seeing as it's just me now, I know for a fact I can't beat you. It'd be better to just give up now instead of fighting you. There'd be no point in it," Shiro said, looking at the male in front of him. "I see, a wise choice," the cloaked figure said as he disappeared. "But foolish nonetheless," Shiro heard the male say behind him, and then felt a heavy pressure on the back of his neck, and him too fell to the ground and watched as his world slowly faded to nothingness. When Shiro finally awoke, he saw that Naruto and Fu were also awake. He tried to move, but when he did, he found his arms tied behind his back and his feet both tied together. Shiro tried to move once again, but he felt some more resistances, suggesting that something was holding the rope that was on his feet and the rope that was around his hands together. When he looked back over to Naruto and Fu, he saw that they were in the position he was in. "So he got you too?" Naruto asked, looking at Shiro. "Something like that, yeah," Shiro said, looking at the two in front of him. "Well, guess this is the end for the Team 12. Man, to think we didn't even get to have our first mission." "Not exactly how I pictured I'd die," Shiro said, looking at them. However, when he said this, he noticed that neither of them said anything back, causing him to sigh. After a few more moments of silence had passed, Shiro finally decided to speak up once again. "It's not you," he said in a quiet voice. "What?" Naruto asked, looking at the white-haired male in front of him. "The two people in this village I hate. It's not the two of you," Shiro said, looking at the ground. "When I was walking home yesterday, I saw that the villagers were staring at the two of you like you had the plague or something. I had never actually seen the demon of this village or the demon lover of this village, so I had no idea it was the two of you. So after I thought about it, I probably sounded like the two people I hated were the two of you," Shiro said, looking at them. "Well then, if it's not us, then who is it?" Fu asked, looking at the white-haired male. "Believe it or not, it's my parents," Shiro said, looking at them. When he said this, however, Naruto and Fu gained a confused look on their face, and Shiro decided to clarify what he meant. "My name's Shiro Ito, as in the heir to the Ito Corporation," Shiro said, looking at them. "I thought that name sounded familiar. Although that doesn't explain why you hate your family," Fu said, looking at the male in front of her. "To put it simply, they don't even know I exist. Being the heir of a company like the Ito Corporation is just too much to handle. Every day they expected more and more of me, and every time I messed up on even the smallest detail, they shunned me. Then came the day I told them I wanted to be a ninja, and things just took an even worse turn. I decided for a while that they were right and that becoming a ninja would be a waste of time," Shiro said, looking at them. "So what happened for you to change your mind?" Naruto asked, looking at them. "I don't know, maybe I was tired of being ignored, or maybe I just didn't want to be responsible for such a big company, but I snapped and left. After the day I left, they completely shunned me and cut me off. According to the letters that they always send me, I'm not even in their will anymore. They're going to give anything they own to a business partner that they have," Shiro said, looking at them. "I still don't understand why you apologized, though," Fu said, looking at the white-haired male in front of her. "I know what it's like to be unappreciated by those you care about, and even though you two don't care about me, I still felt as if it was wrong to go on letting the two of you think that I was talking about the two of you, where in reality nothing was further from the truth. I guess it's a bit late to tell you this now, seeing as how we're all probably going to die, but oh well, it's like they say, die with a clear conscience," Shiro said, looking at them. When he said this to Fu, it seemed like just another sad story, but for Naruto it was a little deeper to him, and as he looked at the white-haired male in front of him, he began to think to himself. He left because he was tired of being unappreciated, he left because he didn't want to go unnoticed anymore, he left his home. "For the same reason I left my home," Naruto thought to himself as he looked at the male. However, their conversation was cut short when they heard footsteps. "I see that all of you are awake. Now we can really get started," the male said, looking at the three of them. The male then walked over to the white-haired male and took out a kunai. When he did, he cut his restraints and handed him a kunai. Shiro looked at it a little confused until the male grabbed Naruto and held a kunai to his neck. "Shiro, I'm giving you a choice. You can kill Fu and Naruto lives, or you can spare Fu, but if you do, I'll kill Naruto. This is a choice that you are being forced to make. Now make a choice and make it quick, otherwise I might just get bored and kill both of them," the male said, looking at him. The white-haired male just stood there motionless, looking at Naruto and the kunai in his hand. The only way to Naruto is to kill Fu, but at the same time, the only way to save Fu is to let him kill Naruto. Then there's the possibility that he'll just kill Naruto after I kill Fu. What do I do? Guess it's time to put some of my company skills to use, Shiro thought, looking at the male. Let's compromise, Shiro said, looking at the male in front of him. That wasn't one of the options, the male said, drawing the blade closer to Naruto's throat. I know, but lowlifes like you are always willing to compromise. Especially when there's money involved, right? Shiro said, looking at the male in front of him. Things like money don't interest me, the male said, looking at him. Then what about weapons? I happen to know that the Ito Corporation is shipping a rather large supply of weapons to the Land of Fire in just a few days. If you know what you're doing, you could not only obtain more weapons for yourself but for the friends that I'm almost certain you have just hidden away, Shiro said, looking at the male. A very tempting offer, but my master would not be pleased if I did such things without his permission, so I'm going to have to pass on this offer, the male said, looking at Shiro. When the white-haired male heard this, he once again became silent and looked at the male in front of him. Damn it, what the hell kind of lowlife is this guy? He's not taking any of my offers. Wait, he said his master wouldn't be, please? Which mean that he's being paid somehow, even if it's not with money. Let's exploit that just a bit, shall we? Shiro thought as he looked at the man in front of him. So what's your master paying you with? If not money, then surely it's some form of insurance, right? I'm sure we could provide the same level of what he's offering, and if not, then we'll make you an even better offer. Sound like a deal? Shiro asked, looking at the male. I'm not comfortable telling you any of this information. Now quit stalling for time and make a decision now, the male said, looking at him. Shiro grew nervous when he heard this and looked at Naruto. Okay, let me think about what my father said about this type of situation. He said that whenever someone is doing something like this, they're trying to deal a crippling blow that is more severe than any other option. In other words, he knows that Naruto and Fu are both stronger than me, which means that if they were both to live, they would have a much higher chance of living than I would with either of them, Shiro thought as he looked at the male in front of him. Well, if nothing else, at least, change the choice just a bit, Shiro said, looking at the male in front of him. I really don't want to, the masked figure started, only to be cut off. Take my life instead, Shiro suddenly yelled out, causing the two figures that were on his team to widen their eyes slightly. Instead of you killing Naruto and me killing Fu, how about you kill me and let the two of them live? Shiro asked, looking at the male figure in front of him. The male figure then dashed towards him and held the kunai to his throat. Is that really what you want? The masked figure asked, looking at the figure in front of him. Shiro started to sweat slightly before he took a deep breath and looked at the male in front of him. Yes, he answered calmly. Then I have just one thing to say to the three of you, he said as he backed away from them. The male then took off his mask and showed a familiar scared face with gray hair. The three of you pass. What? Naruto asked, a little confused. Each Jonin squad leader has to test their genin squad to see if they really have what it takes to be shinobi. I came up with the hardest test I could think of so that no one would pass, but the three of you somehow did everything correctly. Neither one of the captives said anything that could endanger their life or the life of their comrades, and the person who was given the choice prolonged the choice as long as he could, and when everything else failed, offered himself up so that his comrades could live. Never thought anyone from the academy would be able to pass this test, Goru said, looking at them. So this was all some kind of test? Fu asked, looking at the elder male in front of her. Yeah, the male said, pulling out a bottle of sake from his jacket. And we passed? Naruto asked, looking at him. Yep, Goru said, taking a large drink of sake. Much better now, I'm not sober anymore, the male said, looking at his team. The three young figures then jumped into the air and let out screams of excitement. Man, something tells me that dealing with the three of them is going to take a lot of sake, Goru said, looking at the three in front of him. Alright, well, tomorrow Team 12 has its first official mission. We'll meet in front of Shibuki office. I hope the three of you are ready, because from here on out it's only going to get tougher and you'll find yourself regretting so many choices. So from here on out, make sure you do your best, the male said, looking at them. Goru then watched as the three of them walked away. He then heard someone land beside him and turned to his side to see a familiar blonde looking at him. So did they fail? She asked, looking at the male looking at him. No, actually, even though I planned everything out, they still came out on top. They passed, Goru said, looking at them. Looks like your days of slacking are over, because you officially have a genin team to take care of, the blonde said, looking at the male in front of her with a smug look on her face. Yeah, although it isn't going to be easy for them. If what Shiro said was true, then soon he really is going to have to make a difficult choice. I just hope he does what's right and makes the choice that will make him happy, Goru said, looking at him. I'm sure he will. You know, he reminds me of his uncle at that age, the blonde said, looking at him. Was I really that annoying as a kid? Goru asked, looking at the blonde female. Yeah, but you were fun back then. So when do you plan on telling him? The blonde asked, looking at him. I'll tell him when the time is right. But for now, I think I'll save him from the heartache of seeing what a mess his uncle has become, Goru said, looking at the blonde female beside him. He looked at the blonde in front of her. That's all for now. If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments.